Imagine it's 1200 BC. You're a merchant in a city that has existed for centuries. Your grandfather traded here, and his grandfather before him. The palace above your house has stood so long that it feels like part of the landscape itself, permanent, immovable, like a mountain. Ships arrive every season loaded with copper from Cyprus, tin from somewhere east of Babylon, grain from Egypt, glass beads from workshops so skilled their methods are basically state secrets. The writing tablets in the palace archive record treaties with kings whose names stretch back generations. This is civilization. This is the world. And then, in what feels like almost no time at all, it's gone. The palace is burning. The harbour is empty. The scribes who kept the records are dead or fled. The roads that connected everything, the whole shimmering network of trade and diplomacy and shared culture that made this corner of the Mediterranean one of the most sophisticated places on earth, just stop. Not slowly, not gradually, almost simultaneously, across a stretch of coastline spanning thousands of miles, something comes through and the lights go out. That is not an exaggeration. That is what the archaeology actually shows. Around 1200 BC, give or take a few decades, civilizations that had endured for centuries began to collapse. Not one of them, not two. Multiple, interconnected, powerful, literate, wealthy societies faltered, and in many cases disappeared entirely within roughly the same window of time. Ugarit, one of the most cosmopolitan trading cities of the ancient world, was destroyed and never rebuilt. The Hittite Empire, which had fought Egypt to a standstill and carved treaties in silver, simply ceased to exist. The Mycenaean palace culture of Greece, the civilization that would later inspire Homer's epics, collapsed so completely that Greece effectively forgot how to write for 400 years. Egypt survived, but barely, and it was never the same again. And at the centre of almost every account of destruction, there is a force, a people or peoples arriving from somewhere, moving across the sea and the land, leaving burning cities behind them. Here's where it gets strange. We have fragments. Egyptian inscriptions describe warriors in feathered headdresses arriving in waves. Letters from desperate kings beg for help that never comes. One tablet from Ugarit describes ships spotted offshore, enemy vessels in the water, and there is no reply tablet because there was no time to send one. The city was already gone. But for all the fragments we have, we cannot fully explain who these people were, where exactly they came from, or where they went when it was over. They appear in the record like a wave appears on a shore, full of force, fully real, and then receding back into water that leaves no trace. Now, we do have a name for them. Sort of. Modern historians call them the Sea Peoples. You'll hear that term throughout this video, and it's the standard label used in archaeology and scholarship, so we'll use it too. But here's something important to understand right from the start. Sea Peoples is not what they called themselves. It's not even what the Egyptians called them. It's a label invented by a 19th century French Egyptologist named Emmanuel de Rouget, who was trying to make sense of certain hieroglyphic inscriptions and needed a way to group people who seemed to be coming from across the water. The label stuck, but it may be doing us a disservice because it implies a single unified group with a shared identity and a common purpose. The actual evidence suggests something far more complicated than that. Possibly a coalition, possibly a migration, possibly waves of refugees, mercenaries and opportunistic raiders all arriving in overlapping and chaotic sequence. Possibly all of these things at once. The truth, if we can call it that, is still being reconstructed from broken pottery and burned roof beams and letters that stopped in the middle of a sentence. And that reconstruction is what this entire video is about. What we're going to do is walk through the evidence piece by piece. Not just the famous Egyptian battle inscriptions, though those are extraordinary, but also the diplomatic letters, the archaeological layers, the climate records locked in pollen samples and tree rings, the trade data that shows copper shipments suddenly vanishing, the genetic research that hints at population movements, the ruins of cities where the fire was so intense that mud brick actually turned to glass. We're going to look at what happened to the Hittites in Anatolia, to the Mycenaeans in Greece, to the cities along the Levantine coast, to Cyprus, which sat right in the middle of all of this like a target that couldn't move. We're going to look at what the battles might actually have looked like, what the soldiers were wearing, how they fought, what they were carrying with them, and we're going to look at the theories. Because there isn't just one, Scholars have been arguing about this collapse for over a century, and the arguments are genuinely fascinating, because every time we think we've found the answer, the evidence gets more complicated. Here is the central mystery in one sentence. Something destroyed or severely disrupted nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean within roughly the same 50-year window, around 1200 BC. And whatever that something was, it left almost no clear trace of where it came from or where it went. That's the kind of historical puzzle that should keep you awake at night. Speaking of which, if you're listening to this late, maybe you can't sleep, or you're on a long drive, or you're somewhere in the world where it's the middle of the afternoon and you've got nothing better to do than fall into a 3,000-year-old mystery, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely read these. Last time I checked, it was people in Tokyo having morning coffee, someone in Dublin at 2 a.m, a person in Sao Paulo who said they were supposed to be working. Wherever you are, you're about to walk through one of the most dramatic and still unsolved collapses in human history. And here's the thing about this particular collapse. The stakes were almost incomprehensibly high. We're not talking about one kingdom falling and another rising to take its place. We're talking about a networked world, arguably one of the first truly networked worlds in human history, coming apart at the seams. The Bronze Age Mediterranean wasn't just a collection of separate kingdoms that happened to exist at the same time, it was an interconnected system. Copper came from Cyprus. Tin came from as far as Afghanistan. Letters were written in languages not native to the senders, because diplomacy ran on a shared script called Akkadian the way international business runs on English today. Kings called each other brother. They exchanged daughters in marriage and grain in emergencies. They shared technologies and art styles and occasionally soldiers. When that system broke, it didn't just take down one civilization, it took down all of them. And then, whoever or whatever did the breaking mostly vanished. That is what we're going to figure out. Or at least we're going to get as close as the evidence will let us. Which turns out to be closer than you might think, and more unsettling than you might expect. Start with the world that existed before all of it fell apart. To understand what was lost, you have to actually feel the weight of what existed. By 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean had been building towards something for centuries. Not just building cities or armies or trade routes, though all of those were happening, it had been building a system. An interconnected, mutually dependent network of kingdoms and city-states and palace economies so tightly woven together that if you pulled a single thread in Cyprus, you'd feel it in Egypt, in Anatolia, in the Greek mainland, in the merchant quarters of cities along the Levantine coast. This wasn't accidental. It was engineered, slowly, over generations, through an almost modern-sounding combination of diplomacy, intermarriage, commerce, and shared bureaucratic infrastructure. Let's meet the players, because the cast matters. Egypt was the oldest power in the room, a civilization already ancient by 1200 BC, rich with agricultural surplus from the Nile flood plain, with a pharaoh at the centre of a religious and administrative system that had been running for nearly 2,000 years. North of Egypt, in what is now Syria and Lebanon, sat a string of Canaanite city-states and port towns, among them Ugarit, arguably the most cosmopolitan city on earth at that moment. Ugarit was the kind of place where you'd hear 5 languages in a single market, where merchants from Cyprus and the Aegean and Mesopotamia all did business simultaneously, where the palace archive contained correspondence in Akkadian, Hurrian, Sumerian, Ugaritic and Cypriot syllabic script all at once. Further north and inland, the Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia, what is now Turkey, a military power that had fought Egypt to a genuine standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, barely a century before the collapse, and had negotiated what some scholars call the world's first surviving peace treaty. West of them, out on the Greek mainland and the Aegean islands, Mycenaean palace culture was at its height. These were the people Homer's epics would later mythologize, though by Homer's time they were already a legend. And at the centre of all of it geographically, sitting in the middle of the Eastern Mediterranean like a distribution hub you'd design on purpose, sat Cyprus, which happened to be sitting on top of some of the largest copper deposits in the ancient world. Then there was Assyria, growing in power to the east, city-states in Canaan and the Levant, kingdoms whose names we barely remember because almost nothing of them survived. These societies were not isolated from one another. That is the crucial thing. They were not just neighbours who occasionally traded or occasionally went to war. They were embedded in each other's economies in ways that made them interdependent in a manner that would feel, familiar to anyone who lived through 2008 or the global supply chain disruptions of the early 2020s. Here's how the trade web actually worked. Cyprus shipped copper, enormous quantities of it, in standardized ingots shaped like stretched ox hides, each one weighing about 29 kilograms, each one stamped and recorded. Tin came from somewhere further east, possibly from mines in what is now Afghanistan or the Caucasus, travelling through Mesopotamia before reaching the ports. Mix copper with tin and you get bronze, which is why this entire age is named after the alloy. But here's the thing, neither Cyprus nor Mesopotamia could produce the other's product. Cyprus had no tin. The tin sources had no copper. Both of them needed a functioning long-distance trade network just to produce the basic material that every palace, every army, every craftsman in the Mediterranean depended on. And that was just one commodity in a system with dozens. Grain moved from Egypt. Textiles, particularly the famous purple-dyed cloth from the Levantine coast, were produced in specialized workshops and traded across enormous distances. Horses came from the steppes to the north and east. Luxury goods, glass, ivory, gold, worked jewellery, exotic resins for perfume and medicine, moved through the system like blood through a circulatory system, pushed along by merchant ships that followed seasonal winds and established routes. The palace system that managed all of this was a bureaucratic marvel. Every major palace maintained what were essentially warehouses of strategic goods. They tracked incoming shipments on clay tablets, distributed rations to palace workers, stockpiled surplus against lean years, and coordinated the production of specialized goods for export. The scribes who ran these systems were literate professionals in a world where literacy was rare. The records they kept were extraordinarily detailed. We know what the palace at Knossos was storing because the Linear B tablets survived in a fire that burned the palace around 1400 BC and accidentally baked the clay into something durable. We know what Ugarit was trading because its archive survived in the destruction layer of 1185 BC. But here is the architectural flaw embedded in the whole glorious structure. It required predictability. The palaces were not designed for improvisation. They were designed for regularized, expected seasonal flows of goods. A palace that knew it would receive copper shipments in spring and grain shipments in autumn could plan its workforce, its ration distributions, its military provisioning, its diplomatic gift exchanges all around those expectations. Interrupt the shipments, and the whole calculation falls apart. The palace couldn't adapt quickly because it wasn't built for adaptation. It was built for management of a known stable system. Diplomacy reinforced this rigidity in interesting ways. The kings of this era communicated through a remarkable correspondence network, writing letters on clay tablets in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, addressing each other as brother or son depending on relative status, exchanging gifts of gold and chariots and princesses in formalized patterns that carried deep political weight. These were not casual exchanges. They were the Bronze Age equivalent of a treaty framework, a way of maintaining peace and mutual obligation through the symbolic language of generosity. The archive of letters found at Amarna in Egypt, correspondence between Pharaoh and the kings of Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, Cyprus, and the Canaanite city-states, reads like the communications of a diplomatic world every bit as formal and self-aware as anything that came after. Which meant that when individual relationships broke down, the diplomatic infrastructure felt it immediately. And there were already signs before 1200 BC that the infrastructure was under stress. Certain letters from the late 13th century hint at anxiety beneath the formal language, requests for grain that have a slightly desperate edge, complaints about shipments that arrived short or late, references to raiders at sea, to disruptions on certain routes, to groups of people moving through regions they had not previously occupied. The Hittite king wrote to the king of Ugarit asking for troops and supplies in terms that suggested urgency rather than routine alliance management. Ugarit itself was apparently fortifying in ways it hadn't needed to before. The palace at Ugarit in its final decades shows signs of a city that knew, on some level, that something was wrong, even if it couldn't quite name what. Economists sometimes talk about how globalization amplifies shocks. Connect enough systems together tightly enough, and a disruption in one place doesn't stay local. It propagates. It finds every node in the network and delivers the same destabilizing message. The thing you were counting on is no longer reliable. The Bronze Age had created, perhaps for the first time in history, a genuinely globalized regional economy, and it had done so without any mechanism for absorbing catastrophic shocks to multiple parts of the system simultaneously. What came next would find that vulnerability with almost surgical precision. Here's the thing about the Bronze Age collapse. It should have disappeared into silence, and for most of history it nearly did. The kingdoms that fell left no survivors capable of writing their own account of what happened. The scribes were gone, the palaces were ash, the bureaucracies that had kept such meticulous records of every copper shipment and grain ration simply ceased to exist. If we had only the archaeological destruction layers to work with, the burned cities and the abandoned palaces, we might never have known there was a human force involved at all. But Egypt survived, and Egypt had something the other collapsed kingdoms didn't. A pharaoh who wanted posterity to know he had won. Two Egyptian sources above all others give us our main window into what happened at the end of the Bronze Age. The first is an inscription commissioned by Pharaoh Merneptah, dating to around 1208 BC, carved onto a large granite stele that was later found reused in his mortuary temple at Thebes. Merneptah was dealing with a combined assault from Libyan peoples allied with groups that the Egyptian text calls, in transliteration, the Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Luka, the Sherden, and the Shekelesh. He claims to have defeated them decisively, listing tens of thousands of enemy dead and thousands of captives. The inscription is triumphant in the way royal inscriptions always are. But embedded in the boastful language are names, specific names, of peoples Egypt clearly considered foreign and threatening, peoples whose origins the Egyptians themselves seem uncertain about. The second and far more elaborate source is the complex of inscriptions and wall reliefs at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Rameses III, dating to around 1177 BC. This is where the story really comes alive, or at least where Egypt's version of it does. Rameses III describes not one but multiple waves of assault, attacks from Libya, a massive land and sea campaign from the north, and he names a new roster of groups that overlaps partially with Merneptah's list but adds others. The Peleset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh again, the Denian, the Veshesh. He describes them in language that is vivid and almost cinematic, claiming they swept down through Anatolia and the Levant like a consuming fire, that no land could stand before them, that Hatti al-Ashir, which is Cyprus, Carchemish, Arzawa al-Ashir again, were destroyed. And then he claims to have stopped them at the borders of Egypt, on land and at sea, in battles that were decisive and total and glorious. The term sea peoples itself doesn't come from ancient Egyptian. The Egyptians wrote of peoples of the sea, but the capitalized taxonomic label sea peoples is a 19th century European scholarly invention, coined by the French Egyptologist Emmanuel de Rouget in 1867, when he was trying to make sense of the Medinet Habu texts. It stuck because it was useful shorthand for a genuinely messy collection of names that seem to share a geographic relationship to maritime activity. But it has also caused enormous confusion ever since, because it implies a coherence, a single unified group with a single origin and a single purpose, that the evidence doesn't actually support. What the evidence does support is more complicated and, frankly, more interesting. Look at the Medinet Habu reliefs carefully, and what you see is not a homogeneous army. The wall carvings at Rameses III's temple are among the most detailed surviving images of the Late Bronze Age, and they show multiple things happening simultaneously. There are naval battles, Egyptian ships with archers engaging enemy vessels in close combat, bodies falling into the water, chaotic and violent and specific in detail. But alongside the warriors, the reliefs show something else entirely. Ox carts. Carts loaded with possessions and women and children. Not a raiding party travelling light and fast, but something that looks disturbingly like a migration. People moving with everything they owned. Families. Livestock. The material contents of entire communities packed onto wagons and pushed south toward Egypt. This is the image that stops historians in their tracks, because it doesn't fit a simple narrative of military invasion. Armies don't typically bring their grandmothers. Raiders don't slow themselves down with ox carts full of domestic goods. Whatever was moving toward Egypt in 1177 BC was not a straightforward military force operating on a clear strategic objective. It was something more desperate, more complicated, and in some ways more frightening. But here is where we have to apply genuine caution, because the source of this imagery is a royal Egyptian propaganda machine of the highest order. Rameses III was a pharaoh under pressure. His reign was troubled by internal conspiracies, economic strain, and the psychological weight of presiding over an empire that was visibly contracting. His mortuary temple inscriptions are not dispassionate historical records. They are theological and political documents designed to present the pharaoh as the divinely ordained savior of civilization itself. When Rameses says that no land could stand before these people, that they destroyed every kingdom from Anatolia to the Levantine coast before he alone turned them back, he is simultaneously making a theological claim and a political one. The more terrifying the enemy, the more magnificent the victory. Scholars refer to this as the propaganda amplification problem, and it runs through every royal inscription of the ancient world. This doesn't mean the events described are fictional. The destruction layers in the archaeological record are real. The burned cities are real. But it means we cannot simply read Rameses III's account as a news report. The scale of enemy numbers, the completeness of their victories elsewhere, the perfection of Egypt's own triumph, all of these need to be filtered through an awareness that the man paying for the inscription had very specific things he needed it to say. What historians try to do, carefully and with considerable disagreement among themselves, is triangulate. Where do the Egyptian inscriptions align with the archaeological record? Where do they diverge? When Rameses lists the Peleset as among the groups that attacked Egypt, and we later find Philistine material culture appearing in the Levant in the decades after the collapse, that's a potentially meaningful connection. When he describes devastation in regions like Hatti and Cyprus, and the archaeology shows those regions were indeed devastated around that time, the inscriptions gain some corroborating weight. But the mechanisms, the causes, the sequence, the motivations, those the inscriptions can't reliably tell us. Which brings us to the central question that has preoccupied scholars for well over a century, and still doesn't have a clean answer. Who are the Sea Peoples, really? The names in the Egyptian texts correspond, with varying degrees of confidence, to later historical populations. The Peleset may become the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible. The Ekwesh might be Achaeans, Mycenaean Greeks. The Sherdan possibly connect to Sardinia. The Lucca to Lycia in southwestern Anatolia. But possibly and might are doing a lot of heavy lifting in all of those sentences, and not every scholar accepts every identification. More fundamentally, even if we could pin down the geographic origins of each named group, we still wouldn't know why they were moving. The Medinet Habu relief suggests some were migrating with their families, which implies displacement rather than conquest as a primary motive. Others appear to be coordinated military forces. The Egyptian records describe them collecting captives, which suggests organised plundering. They may also have included mercenaries, since Egypt itself had previously employed Sherdan soldiers as palace guards, apparently absorbing some of the same people they would later fight. Raiders, refugees, mercenaries, a coalition of the desperate and the opportunistic, moving through a collapsing world and finding that the old rules no longer applied. Maybe all of those things at once, maybe different groups for different reasons, caught up in the same catastrophic moment, moving in roughly the same direction because the same forces that were destroying the civilizations ahead of them were also destroying whatever was behind them. That possibility, that the Sea Peoples were not so much a cause of the collapse as a symptom of it, a human flood produced by disasters already in motion, is one of the most important ideas in the entire debate. But to understand it fully, you need to hear what the cities themselves were saying in their final hours. Ugarit was one of those places that makes you rethink what the Late Bronze Age actually looked like. We tend to imagine this world as a patchwork of isolated kingdoms, each tucked safely behind its own walls, trading occasionally, but living mostly in its own little bubble. Ugarit blows that picture apart. Sitting on the northern Levantine coast, in what is now Syria, Ugarit was less a sleepy port and more a Bronze Age router node. Its harbour looked west across the Mediterranean, its inland routes linked east to Mesopotamia and south to Canaan and Egypt. Its merchants dealt in copper from Cyprus, timber from the nearby mountains, tin from who knows where, and luxury goods from everywhere. Its scribes wrote in multiple languages on thousands of clay tablets: Akkadian, Hurrian, Hittite, Egyptian, and a local alphabetic script that's one of the earliest known. If you wanted to see the Late Bronze Age international system in miniature, you'd walk into the archives of Ugarit. And that's exactly what archaeologists did. 3,000 years too late. They uncovered bureaucratic tablets on taxes and cargoes, diplomatic letters to Hittite kings and Egyptian officials, legal contracts between merchants, temple accounts, school exercises. It's the paper trail of a city that lived by the sea and by the pen. But among those tablets there is another category. A small cluster of texts that, even now, feel like they're still hot from the kiln. They are the last letters from Ugarit. Unlike the triumphal inscriptions of pharaohs carved decades later in stone, these were written while things were actually falling apart. They were baked not as monuments, but almost by accident, because the buildings they were stored in burned, hardening the clay and freezing the words mid-crisis. And when you read them, the Bronze Age collapse stops being an abstract pattern of destruction layers on a chart and becomes something else entirely. It becomes someone's inbox on the worst day of their life. One of the most famous letters is from the king of Ugarit, Hammurapi, writing to the king of Alashia, probably Cyprus, around the very end of the city's existence. It's short, rushed, and desperate. The letter begins in the usual formal style, titles, honorifics, diplomatic politeness, but then it veers sharply into alarm. Hammurapi says enemy ships have been sighted. He insists that his forces are stretched thin, that his cities are undefended because his troops and ships are already away on other assignments. In one widely cited translation, he says something along the lines of, "The enemy ships are here, my cities are burned, and you know my army and chariots are in Hatti, and my ships in Lycia. I am left like a woman with no protection." That last metaphor tells you a lot about the gender assumptions of Bronze Age royal rhetoric, but it also tells you something more important. This wasn't a kingdom waiting passively for disaster. Ugarit was doing what a vassal state in a hierarchical international system was supposed to do. It had sent troops to its overlord, the Hittite great king. It had sent ships elsewhere. It had honoured its obligations. And now, at the exact moment it needed help, it had nothing left to defend itself. There are other letters too. One from an Ugaritic official warning a local commander that enemy vessels have been seen offshore and that the city is in danger. Another from a high-ranking Hittite official ordering the shipment of grain because Ugarit is apparently suffering from famine on top of everything else. Still others mention bands of marauders, raids inland, the inability to protect merchant convoys. If you line them up chronologically, you don't get a neat narrative. What you get is the sound of someone frantically hitting send on message after message as different parts of the system fail. There are pleas for ships, pleas for troops, pleas for food, references to orders from Hatti that can no longer be carried out because the roads aren't safe, complaints that messengers have been attacked, hints that neighbouring regions are also in chaos, and then, abruptly, nothing. No follow-up, no, all clear, no, we survived, or we fell. The story of Ugarit's end vanishes mid-sentence, and archaeology has to pick it up from there. When excavators first began peeling back the layers of the site in the 20th century, they found exactly what those letters would lead you to expect: a destruction layer. Across the city, especially in the palace district and in wealthy residential areas, there is evidence of intense fire. Roofs collapsed and were carbonized. Walls show signs of heat. Objects lie where they fell. The archives, full of tablets that would normally have remained unfired, are baked solid, preserved only because the blaze that destroyed the buildings turned their clay into ceramic. What you don't see is a slow decline or a careful dismantling of the city. You see abrupt abandonment. Workshops sit with tools still in place. Storage jars are smashed or left partly full. Household goods don't seem to have been systematically removed. There's little sign of people coming back later to reuse or repair. After the destruction, Ugarit doesn't recover as an independent port. It effectively vanishes from history. This has led many scholars to picture a sudden raid. Enemy ships appear off the coast. Perhaps while much of the city's military strength is away, attackers land quickly, loot and burn, and sail off, leaving a smoking ruin that no one ever rebuilds. It's a tidy scenario. It fits the letters. It fits the destruction. It connects neatly with the idea of mobile raiders, the same kind of sea-born warriors we see in the Egyptian reliefs, moving along the Levantine coast, hitting wealthy cities one by one. But the reality, as always, is more complicated. For one thing, dating Ugarit's destruction with precision has been a decades-long argument. Pottery styles, inscriptional cross-references, Egyptian chronology, and radiocarbon results all get pulled into the debate, and the answers don't line up perfectly. Some archaeologists place the final destruction of Ugarit slightly before Rameses III's big Sea People's battle, maybe around 1190 BC, possibly earlier. Others argue for a date closer to 1177 BC, putting it right into the same window that Egyptian records claim chaos along the coast. The margins of error are big enough that you can't simply pin a date on it and say, this tablet was written the same year as that Egyptian inscription. That uncertainty matters. If Ugarit fell early, it could mean that the forces hitting it were part of an earlier wave of disruption, or even largely local actors taking advantage of an overstretched kingdom. If it fell later, it fits more comfortably into a coordinated or at least cascading set of movements in the eastern Mediterranean. Then there's the question of what exactly caused the flames that archaeologists see. A raid is one option, but not the only one. Some have suggested a drawn-out siege, perhaps combined with internal stress. The letters about famine and grain shipments hint at food shortages. If the city was struggling to feed itself, a prolonged blockade might have pushed it over the edge. Fire at the end of a siege is hardly rare in ancient warfare. Others point to the possibility of internal unrest. Ugarit was a vassal state in a tangled web of obligations, to the Hittite Empire, to its own elites, to foreign merchants who had set up shop in the city. If the central authority weakened, because of Hittite instability, economic strain, or crop failures, factions inside the city might have begun fighting for power. In that scenario, outside raiders might be the spark, but civil conflict could be the fuel. And above all of this loom the larger environmental and economic questions. We know from multiple lines of evidence that the eastern Mediterranean around this time was suffering significant climate stress, likely multi-year, possibly multi-decade drought in some regions. Pollen cores, lake levels, and textual references to famine from other sites all point in the same general direction. If the harvests failed inland, that would hit Ugarit's role as a trade broker hard. Less surplus grain moving through its docks, more desperate refugees and bandits along its roads, more pressure on already stretched civic institutions. Under those conditions, an attack from the sea, whether by sea peoples, local pirates, displaced coastal groups, or some combination of all three, might not have needed to be especially large or especially well organized to be fatal. A city living on the edge, short on food, short on troops, trying to honor its obligations to distant overlords, suddenly finds itself facing armed ships on its horizon and unrest in its hinterland. You can imagine how quickly the situation could tip from manageable to catastrophic. The last letters don't spell any of this out. They don't say climate crisis or economic collapse. Ancient kings were not in the habit of writing policy memos about systemic failure. They wrote about the immediate, the tangible, enemy ships, missing soldiers, empty granaries, but that immediacy is exactly what makes them so powerful. Royal victory inscriptions, like those of Rameses III, are composed after the fact. They're smoothed, edited, shaped into a coherent story with a clear hero and a clear enemy. They are meant to be read generations later, to proclaim stability and divine favour. The letters from Ugarit are not. They are rough, reactive, often written in a hurry. They reveal confusion, not clarity, panic, not propaganda. No one in Ugarit was thinking about how these words would sound to archaeologists 3 millennia later. They were thinking about trying somehow to survive the week, and because of that, they give us something we almost never get for the late Bronze Age collapse. A real-time perspective from inside a system as it fails. For historians, this makes Ugarit a kind of Rosetta Stone of crisis. You see a cosmopolitan coastal city that had thrived on maritime trade for centuries, suddenly discovering that the very sea that fed it has become a highway for danger. You see a diplomatic hub, embedded in international alliances, finding that its allies are distant, distracted, or collapsing themselves. You see a bureaucracy that once kept track of hundreds of shipments, reduced to begging for a single cargo of grain. You also see how tightly tied Ugarit was into the same networks that the Egyptian inscriptions claim were going up in flames. Ugarit's king mentions his troops in Hatti. The Hittite Empire itself would soon vanish as a coherent political entity. He mentions his ships in Lycia, a region that appears in Egyptian texts as Luca, one of the troublesome maritime peoples. He writes to Al-Ashia, probably Cyprus, whose own archaeological record shows destruction and disruption at roughly the same time. When Ugarit falls, it's not just one city going dark, it's a hub in a larger system going offline. Copper from Cyprus can no longer move through Ugarit's warehouses to the inland palaces that rely on it for bronze weapons and tools. Merchants whose fortunes depend on predictable shipping routes suddenly face piracy, broken contracts, unpaid debts. Diplomatic channels that once carried letters, envoys, and marriage alliances now carry nothing at all. The coastal security that had made the eastern Mediterranean a relatively safe space for high-value cargo for centuries seems to fray all at once. And here's where Ugarit's last letters connect directly back to the Sea Peoples debate. If you read them with the Egyptian accounts in mind, they sound like ground-level confirmation of a larger process. Armed groups on ships, hitting cities along the coast, overwhelming defences that are already under strain, contributing to the fragmentation of a long-standing trade system. If you read them with an eye toward internal dynamics, climate, famine, political instability, they sound like the cries of a city that was already in trouble, for whom any external blow, whether from raiders, refugees, mercenaries or neighbouring rivals, was going to be amplified by existing vulnerabilities. Either way, what they show is that by the time Egypt was carving huge scenes of naval battles into stone, the storm had already broken elsewhere. The last letters from Ugarit are not the beginning of the collapse. They're a snapshot from the middle of it, taken from the bridge of a ship that is already listing badly. And when that ship finally goes under, the wave doesn't stop there. It rolls on along the coast, to Hatti's heartland in Anatolia, to the island of Cyprus and its copper, to the palaces of Mycenaean Greece, leaving behind more burned cities, more abandoned harbours, and more questions. Because if a city as connected, as sophisticated, and as diplomatically plugged in as Ugarit could send out so many calls for help, and still receive none that mattered, then something far larger than a single raiding party was failing. The international system itself was coming apart. To see how far that unravelling went, and what it did to some of the greatest powers of the age, we have to leave the coast of Ugarit and move inland, into the highlands of Anatolia, into the land of Hatti, and a capital called Hattusa that would go from running an empire to burning in silence. At its height, the Hittite Empire looked indestructible on a map. From their capital at Hattusa, high in the central Anatolian plateau, the great kings of Hatti controlled a patchwork of lands stretching from western Turkey almost to the Euphrates, and from the Black Sea region down into northern Syria. This wasn't a neat, solid block of colour the way we like to shade empires in modern textbooks. It was more like a spider web. At the centre was the royal heartland, the core provinces around Hattusa, with their fortified cities, state-run fields, royal granaries and road stations. Radiating out from that you had directly controlled territories, then more loosely held border zones, and beyond that a ring of vassal kingdoms, Carchemish, Ugarit, Amurru, and dozens of smaller polities whose rulers called themselves servants of the Hittite king, while spending most of their time trying not to act like it. Holding this whole structure together wasn't just about chariots and intimidation, it was about logistics. Hatti was a land power. Unlike Egypt, it didn't have the Nile as a predictable conveyor belt of food and transport. Instead, the Hittites built an inland system of roads and way stations, with relay points for messengers, depots for provisions, and a network of royal storehouses that could, in theory, move grain and troops across hundreds of kilometres. We know this in part because of the sheer number of administrative tablets from Hattusa and other sites. There are ration lists for workers and soldiers, records of grain shipments from the fertile lowlands to the drier central plateau, letters complaining that a promised convoy hasn't arrived yet. Kings issue orders that such and such vassal must send X thousand measures of grain as tax. They threaten provincial governors who fail to meet their quotas. They redirect shipments to feed temple personnel, troops on campaign, and sometimes, as we saw with Ugarit, vassal cities in crisis. In normal times, this was the empire's superpower. If a frontier province had a bad harvest, the centre could, at least on paper, send food from elsewhere. If a vassal got rebellious, the king could send a letter to another vassal, ordering them to cut off supplies or send troops. The roads and grain routes were the empire's bloodstream. But that kind of system has a dark side. It's exquisitely sensitive to disruption. Cut the roads, lose a harvest, or knock out a major storage centre, and the damage doesn't just stay local, it ripples through everything connected to it. By the late 13th century BC, those ripples were turning into waves. On almost every frontier, Hatti was under pressure. To the north, in the forested mountains along the Black Sea, lived the Kaska, loosely organised highland groups who had been the Hittites' nightmare neighbours for centuries. The Hittites rarely portrayed the Casca as a united enemy. Instead, they show up in texts as a constant irritation, raiding border towns, cutting roads, burning fields, interrupting communication between core provinces. Several Hittite kings boast about campaigning against the Casca, resettling them, driving them back, or dragging captives south to work as forced labour. The very repetition of these claims tells you something. No matter how many times Hatti hit them, the problem never really went away. When the empire was strong, it could afford annual punitive expeditions, troop rotations, and rebuilding efforts. When it wasn't, those northern raids could suddenly matter a lot more. To the east, beyond the upper Euphrates, loomed another danger: Assyria. In earlier centuries, Assyria had been weaker, hemmed in by other powers, but by the time we reach the reigns of the last Hittite kings, the Assyrians are a rising aggressive force. Hittite and Assyrian texts alike talk about contested territories in northern Mesopotamia, shifting alliances with smaller states wedged between the two giants, and tense negotiations over who controls which city. Every soldier the Hittites sent east to watch Assyria was one less they could spare elsewhere. Every time a frontier governor wrote a panicked letter about Assyrian incursions, the king faced a familiar ancient problem: too many fires, not enough buckets. South of the core, down in Syria, things were even more volatile. That region was Hatti's lifeline to Mediterranean trade and to the wealthy city-states that provided both revenue and strategic depth. Carchemish, on the Euphrates, was essentially a second capital, run by a branch of the royal family. Other cities, like Ugarit, were bound to Hatti by treaty. In theory, they were supposed to stabilise the frontier, feed troops, and project Hittite influence. In practice, late Bronze Age Syria was a maze of overlapping loyalties and resentments. Egyptian influence still lingered. Local dynasties pursued their own agendas, and the same movements of people and ships that were battering the coast were also disturbing inland routes. Letters from this period are full of complaints about unreliable allies, disloyal vassals, and neighbouring kings who, as one Hittite ruler puts it, speak fair words but do not act accordingly. So you have a central empire increasingly ringed by stress, Casca harassment in the north, Assyrian competition in the east, unstable vassals and raider-infested sea lanes in the south and west. Under ideal circumstances, a strong, well-organised government might still have managed this. But inside the palace walls at Hattusa, those circumstances were breaking down too. One of the constant hazards of Bronze Age monarchy was succession. When your entire system depends on a single great king, anything that complicates the transfer of that title can spiral quickly. Hatti was no exception. Over its history, the empire saw coups, usurpations, royal brothers and sons turning on each other, and internal investigations into who was loyal to which claimant to the throne. By the time we reach the last generations of the empire, the great kings are already dealing with the aftershocks of earlier political quakes. The famous king Suppiluliuma I had expanded Hittite power dramatically, but he also left behind sons and grandsons with overlapping claims and resentments. At least one later king, Mursili III, also called Urhi-Teshub, was deposed by his uncle Hattusili III, leading to a war of letters where the deposed king appealed to Egypt for help, and the usurper justified himself in long defensive narratives. Those palace disputes weren't just personal drama. When one faction won, its rivals might be exiled, stripped of lands, or pushed into border postings where loyalty could not always be taken for granted. Governors and vassal kings had to guess which way the wind in Hattusa was blowing, choose wrong, and your entire dynasty could be wiped out as traitors. Internal politics also affected basic competence. A king who came to power through a coup might owe favours to supporters, stuffing key positions with allies rather than the most capable administrators. Royal energies that might have been spent on reform, infrastructure, or calm diplomacy instead went into shoring up legitimacy, watching rivals and rewriting history tablets. Now add external shocks. Years of poor harvests, rising Assyria, more aggressive Casca raids, restive Syrian vassals, and the strange, poorly understood movements of people along the coasts and islands, the very groups that Egyptian records would later call sea peoples. At some point the system crossed a threshold. For Hattusa itself, our evidence comes mostly from what archaeologists have dug out of the central Anatolian soil. The picture is stark. The upper city and palace areas show clear signs of destruction by fire. Massive fortification gates, once decorated with lion and sphinx reliefs, stand over layers of ash and collapsed brick. Storage rooms that once held grain and supplies are found empty or filled with debris. Administrative tablets like those in Ugarit are often baked hard by heat. After this destruction, something important doesn't happen. The city isn't rebuilt as an imperial capital. There is some later, more modest occupation in parts of the site, but the days of Hattusa as the nerve centre of a great kingdom are over. The script of the empire's bureaucracy, cuneiform written in Hittite, is no longer produced there on a large scale. There's no sign of a new great king re-establishing his authority and issuing triumphant records of recovery. So we know Hattusa burned. We know it was abandoned as a capital. What we don't know, with precision, is who lit the match, or even if there was a single match at all. For a long time it was tempting to plug the Sea Peoples directly into this gap. If Egyptian inscriptions boast of repelling great coalitions of foreign peoples and showing them being crushed in battles, and if around the same general time Hattusa goes up in flames, then maybe the same attackers who ravaged the Levantine coast marched inland, stormed the Hittite capital, and burned it. It's a clean narrative. It's also, as far as current evidence goes, mostly speculation. There are no contemporary Hittite texts from the very end that say, invaders from the sea have reached the capital. There are no inscriptions in Hattusa itself naming the Sea Peoples or showing them on reliefs. The archaeological destruction layer doesn't come with convenient graffiti saying burned by foreign raiders or self-inflicted during civil war. Instead, we have timing that's roughly similar, a broader pattern of regional destruction, and hints from letters that things were already coming apart before Hattusa fell. Some late Hittite texts talk about severe grain shortages, orders for emergency shipments, and the difficulties of keeping vassals obedient. There are references to moving the court temporarily to other locations, which might indicate that the capital was becoming unsafe or unsustainable, even before the final catastrophe. The Kaska, ever present in the north, are one candidate for the role of local arsonists. If imperial control weakened enough, those mountain groups, long familiar with Hittite defences and routes, might have pushed deeper than ever before, striking at the heartland rather than just nibbling at the edges. Some scholars suggest that what we see at Hattusa is the culmination of centuries of guerrilla-style pressure, odd for a tidy single battle, but very plausible as the last act of a slow grind. Others point to possible internal conflict. In a world where the central authority is faltering, grain is short, vassals are unreliable, enemies are circling, fights within the elite can turn deadly fast. A failed coup, a regional governor refusing orders, a faction that decides to carve out its own kingdom rather than go down with a sinking ship, all of these could have led to deliberate burning of parts of the capital, either as a scorched earth measure or as collateral damage in street-level fighting. And then, layered on top of all this, you still have the wider context of people on the move around the eastern Mediterranean. Some of the groups that later show up in Assyrian and biblical texts, like the Mushki or Phrygians, might have been pushing into Anatolia during or soon after this period, though the dates are debated. Whether or not we label them Sea Peoples, the idea that Anatolia was seeing new populations arriving, older ones shifting, and power structures being renegotiated is widely accepted. In that kind of environment, it's entirely possible that Hattusa's end was not a single cinematic siege, but a short cascade. Supply lines disrupted by Kaska or other raiders, local allies peeling away, internal factions grabbing what they could, and finally some combination of enemy attack and deliberate abandonment that ended with fire in the palace district and silence in the archives. However it happened, the fall of Hattusa did not mean the instant disappearance of Hittite culture. Empires almost never evaporate that cleanly. Along the upper Euphrates and in southern Anatolia and northern Syria, what we call Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite city-states appear in the early Iron Age. Places like Carchemish, Melid, Zinchirli, and others show clear continuity from late Bronze Age Hittite traditions. Their rulers use Hittite royal titles. They carve monuments in a mixture of hieroglyphic Luwian, the pictographic script used in some Hittite and Luwian inscriptions, and local styles. Their art shows familiar motifs, processions of gods, kings making offerings, imagery that would look very much at home to a sculptor from Hattusa. Some of these polities are probably run by cadet branches of the old royal family, or by former provincial elites who managed to land on their feet. Others might be more hybrid, local dynasts who adopted Hittite trappings, because that was the prestige tradition they knew. Either way, they're a reminder that when we say the Hittite Empire collapsed, we're talking about the disintegration of a particular political superstructure, not the extinction of a people overnight. What vanishes is the ability to coordinate across the entire plateau and Syrian frontier, the spiderweb of vassals and roads and grain shipments that once answered to Hattusa. What survives are local threads, city-states that still write in related languages, still worship many of the same gods, still carve similar monuments, but no longer have a central spider in the middle of the web. For the rest of the late Bronze Age world, though, that distinction might not have mattered much. From the outside, the effect was the same. Where there had been a great king of Hatti, who could send orders, troops, and wheat, there were now a scattering of smaller rulers who could not. When Ugarit's king wrote that his troops and chariots were in Hatti, he was invoking a power that, within a few years or decades, would cease to exist in any meaningful way. The destruction of Hattusa marks the moment when that promise, the idea that there is a vast land empire inland that can stabilize things, punish raiders, and deliver grain, goes up in smoke. And once that inland pillar is gone, the shock travels outward. Vassals who depended on Hittite protection are suddenly adrift. Trade routes that relied on Hittite guarantees become dangerous. Egypt's northern neighbour, once a formidable land rival, has turned into a patchwork of smaller states more concerned with their own survival than with grand diplomacy. The map is not empty, but it is fractured, and that fracture sets the stage for what happens next, on the Greek mainland, in the coastal cities of the Levant, and out on the islands that supplied the copper and tin that made the Bronze Age what it was. Because Hatti's fall wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was one more major support beam in a regional system giving way, and when you pull out a beam that big, the palaces across the sea can't help but feel the tremor. Across that sea, on the rocky peninsulas and islands of the Aegean, there was another kind of palace world that had grown up in parallel with Hatti and Egypt. We call it Mycenaean Greece, after the great hilltop fortress of Mycenae, but that name is a bit misleading. There was no single Mycenaean empire. No one king ruling all of Greece the way the great king of Hatti ruled Anatolia. Instead, imagine a patchwork of fortified palace centres, each ruling its own territory, each plugged into the same broader system of trade and diplomacy that connected Hatti, Ugarit, Cyprus and Egypt. At places like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, and later discovered sites such as the Menelaean near Sparta, the palaces were not just royal residences. They were economic engines, administrative hubs, small-scale command centres. Thick walls of cyclopean stone encircled Megaron halls, with central hearths and painted frescoes. In storerooms, jars of oil and wine stood in rows. Workshops hummed with metalworkers, potters, perfumers, textile workers, and like their counterparts in Hattusa and Ugarit, the people running these complexes were obsessed with records. We know this because of the clay tablets they left behind, written in a script called Linear B. For a long time, nobody could read it. Then, in the early 1950s, it was deciphered and turned out not to be some lost Minoan language or something exotic and unknown, but an early form of Greek. That alone is a bit of a time travel shock. When you look at a Linear B tablet, you're effectively looking at the oldest written Greek we currently have. What those tablets tell us is revealing, and, in a way, a little disappointing if you're hoping for sweeping epics. They are not heroic poems, philosophical musings, or histories. They are bureaucracy, lists of sheep, inventories of bronze, records of who owes what to whom, notes on rations for workers, allocations of grain, shipments of oil, counts of chariot wheels, armour and weapons. They read like a Bronze Age accountant's notebook. Underneath all that paperwork, though, you can see how the system worked. The palace was the centre of a redistributive economy. Farmers, shepherds, and craftsmen owed goods and labour to the palace. The palace collected these, stored them, transformed them. Grain into bread, wool into textiles, copper and tin into bronze weapons, and then handed them back out again. To support specialists, to equip warriors, to fund religious rituals, to maintain ships, to curry favour with powerful families. Titles on the tablets indicate a hierarchy of officials, land managers, overseers of herds, leaders of small territories. Certain families seem to control particular chunks of land and labour, hinting at a local aristocracy tightly bound to the palace but not identical with the king. Linear B also shows something else, anxiety about war. At Pylos, for instance, we find tablets that list rowers and coastal guard assignments, notices of armour and chariot equipment being checked and rechecked. Some tablets look like emergency mobilisation orders. Men from this district to the coast. Watchers posted here and here. Those tablets are probably written in the very last months before Pylos is destroyed. The bureaucrats are still doing what bureaucrats do, counting, categorising, trying to impose order. But, between the lines, you can feel the pressure. When you look at the archaeological record across the Greek mainland, that pressure eventually breaks through. The end of the palace system in Greece is not one neat single event, any more than it is in Anatolia. It's a scattered pattern of destruction, abandonment, and gradual unravelling that plays out differently in different regions. Take Mycenae itself. The citadel shows multiple destruction levels in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. At one point, there is massive burning in parts of the palace complex. Walls are later refortified. New structures are built. It doesn't look like a simple, they came, they burned it, we left forever moment. It looks like a place that takes serious damage, recovers, limps along, then takes more. At Pylos, in the southwest Peloponnese, the story is shorter and sharper. The palace there, often called the Palace of Nestor after Homer's later character, burns. The destruction layer is obvious. Thick ash, collapsed roofs, rooms frozen in the moment of catastrophe. Linear B tablets were accidentally fired hard by the heat, which is why we have them at all. After that destruction, there is no major rebuilding of the palace. The centralised administration that had been recording every sack of grain and every sheep seems to vanish. In Thebes, in central Greece, there are multiple phases as well. Some major buildings burn, others show signs of reuse and remodelling. The picture is complicated by later construction. Thebes is one of those cities that never really stopped being occupied. But even there, you can trace interruptions, changes in pottery, declines in long-distance imports. Other sites tell different stories. Some fortified citadels stay occupied, sometimes even more heavily defended with new walls, new gateworks, new storage facilities. Smaller settlements on hills or easily defendable positions show increased use. In parts of western Greece and on some islands, there is less evidence of dramatic burning and more evidence of slow change. Fewer imported luxury goods, simpler ceramics, more local styles, fewer signs of a centralised palace hierarchy. So, was Greece destroyed in one massive invasion? The archaeological record doesn't support a single sweep. Instead, it looks like a regional mosaic. Some palaces burn suddenly around the transition from the 13th to 12th centuries. Others fizzle out more gradually. Some areas keep going with modifications, some decline more sharply. It's uneven in time and space. That unevenness is one reason scholars have been arguing for decades about what exactly happened. Several broad families of explanation keep coming up. One is the external attack model. In this view, Greece is hit by waves of raiders, migrants, or returning mercenaries, often equated with the sea peoples that show up in Egyptian reliefs. The fortified citadels, the burned palaces, the Pylian tablets talking about coastal watchers, all of this is read as evidence for outside aggression. According to this interpretation, maybe fleets of desperate warriors and their families, displaced from elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, targeted the wealthiest, most centralised nodes, the palaces. Once those were sacked, the wider system collapsed. Another view shifts the cause more inward, toward internal rebellion or social breakdown. The Mycenaean palaces were extractive. They pulled in resources from wide territories, concentrated wealth, and supported a relatively narrow elite. If repeated famines, trade disruptions, or succession crises hit, resentments at the bottom could have boiled over. Subjugated communities, frustrated lower elites, or regional leaders could have turned on the palace, burned it, and set up smaller-scale, less centralised forms of organisation. In this scenario, the palaces fall not primarily because of foreign invaders, but because their own social structures become too brittle to withstand stress. Closely related is the idea of elite competition. Linear B hints at a complex world of important families and local power brokers who owed allegiance to the palace, but also had their own bases of support. In times of plenty, the central king could keep these figures satisfied with land, gifts, and positions. In times of shortage, that balance might fail. Rival factions might fight for control within the citadel. One group, shut out of power, might ally with outside raiders, or simply torch the palace rather than let another lineage take it. Evidence of internal burning, hastily destroyed or abandoned shrines, and the fact that some fortifications are strengthened after initial destruction fits with the picture of recurring, localized struggles among the elite. Then there is the economic angle. The Mycenaean palaces depended on long-distance trade for prestige goods, and possibly for key raw materials, especially metals, copper from Cyprus, tin from further afield, fine oils and luxury items from the Levant. These weren't just nice extras. They were part of how kings demonstrated legitimacy, rewarded followers, and maintained diplomatic ties. When those networks frayed, because Hatti is in trouble, because coastal cities like Ugarit are being hit, because piracy makes routes dangerous, the palace economy might have started to crack from the inside. If the flow of bronze, luxury goods, and imported grain slowed or stopped, the whole redistributive machine could grind and seize. Under that kind of stress, any additional shock, drought, an earthquake, a raid, a botched succession, could turn a strained system into a failing one. Those theories aren't mutually exclusive. It's entirely plausible that Mycenaean Greece experienced some combination of external attack, internal rebellion, elite infighting, and economic disruption triggered by the wider Bronze Age crisis. The key point is that the end of the palace system is not a single bullet, but a cluster of overlapping pressures that play out differently in different places. One of the wildest parts of this story is the role of the sea itself. The Mycenaeans were not landlocked bureaucrats, they were seafarers. Ship frescoes from places like Pylos and the earlier Minoan world suggest fleets of oared vessels crisscrossing the Aegean. Archaeology shows Mycenaean pottery turning up all over, on Cyprus, along the Levantine coast, even as far away as Sicily and southern Italy. Some of that represents formal trade, some probably represents gifts or diplomatic exchanges, and some may already, even before the collapse, represent raiding. When central authorities are strong, those ships can be organized, taxed, and directed. Palaces can send expeditions, regulate harbors, maintain some order in sea lanes. But as the big nodes of power start to falter, Hatti crumbling inland, Levantine cities under strain, Egypt stretched thin, those same ships become something else, tools for opportunists. The boundary between trader, mercenary, and pirate in this world is fuzzy. A crew paid to escort cargo can turn to raiding if their pay stops coming. Warriors who fought abroad as allies or hired muscle can come home with combat experience and no easy way to reintegrate into peacetime economies. Groups uprooted by famine, war, or political shifts, whether from Anatolia, the Aegean islands, or further west, can take to the sea looking for new places to settle. The Aegean, with its countless harbours and island hideouts, is perfect terrain for this kind of ambiguous maritime activity. Egyptian texts that mention groups like the Shurden and Shekelesh hint that some of these seaborne fighters were already active as mercenaries and pirates before the full-blown collapse. Some wore horned helmets and carried round shields, equipment that later shows up in ways that look suspiciously Aegean. Whether or not every group named in the Egyptian inscriptions had a Greek origin, it's hard to imagine the Aegean being calm and orderly while the rest of the eastern Mediterranean is on fire. As palatial oversight loosens, coastal communities in Greece would have faced growing uncertainty. Foreign ships appearing offshore, opportunities for profitable raids on weakened neighbours, the temptation to seize cargo rather than negotiate for it. The same maritime skills that had once plugged them into a stable system of trade and diplomacy now feed into a much more chaotic world of piracy, ad hoc alliances, and opportunistic violence. When historians talk about what comes after all this in Greece, they often use a loaded phrase, the Greek Dark Age. From roughly the 12th to the 9th centuries BC, the archaeological record shows a clear decline in certain things. The great palaces are gone. Large-scale monumental architecture disappears. The Linear B writing system vanishes. Pottery styles simplify. Imported luxuries from the Near East become rarer. Burial customs change. Population appears to drop in many regions with fewer and smaller settlements. If you're looking only at palatial level complexity, then yes, the lights dim. But that Dark Age label can be misleading. It doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means the kinds of things that leave obvious, elite, centralized traces are happening less. Below that level, there's continuity. People keep farming. They keep herding animals. Local pottery traditions do not vanish. They evolve. Some religious practices seem to persist at particular sanctuaries that show use from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, even if the scale is smaller and the buildings more modest. Certain place names survive. Many later Greek myths and epics, like those about Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos and Thebes, almost certainly preserve dim memories of this earlier palatial world filtered through centuries of retelling. There is also adaptation and innovation. In the later part of this Dark Age, Greece adopts iron more fully as a tool and weapon metal. New styles of pottery emerge and spread. Burial practices become more standardized in some regions. At some point in the early 1st millennium BC, writing returns in a new form, the Greek alphabet, inspired by Phoenician models. When that happens, the ability to record stories and laws and contracts doesn't reappear into a vacuum. It drops into a society that has already been reshaped by centuries of living without palaces. Those intervening centuries are also a time of movement and mixing. As the palaces fall and their redistributive grip weakens, people move. Some communities from the Greek mainland and islands seem to push west into the central Mediterranean, contributing to what archaeologists see as Mycenaean-looking influences in Italy and Sicily. Others move east, into western Anatolia and the coastal zones that later Greek tradition associates with migrations of Ionians, Aeolians, and Dorians. Trying to match those later legendary migration stories directly to the archaeological record is tricky. The timelines don't align neatly. The myths are politically shaped. The names shift. But you can see what later Greeks were trying to make sense of. A past in which populations had clearly moved, mixed, split, and recombined across the Aegean and western Anatolia. They inherit cities where the deepest ruins are Mycenaean, but the current inhabitants speak slightly different dialects and claim descent from people who came from somewhere else. On the Anatolian side, similar blending is happening. As Hatti splinters and new groups filter into the plateau, the coastal zones become a mosaic of older Anatolian populations, incoming groups from the Balkan side of the straits, and Aegean seafarers who settle along the shore. Over time, this melting pot will produce the world that later Greeks call Ionia and Aeolis, and that Assyrians will know as home to various Ionians or Yauna. The key link is this. The fall of the Mycenaean palaces is not just a local Greek story. It's one strand in a much larger fabric of turmoil stretching from central Anatolia to the Levant and beyond. As the redistributive centres collapse in Greece, the Aegean becomes both a highway and a buffer, funneling people, goods, and ideas in new directions. Some groups who might, in an earlier century, have become loyal palace-dependent farmers or craftsmen, instead become part of mobile, semi-rootless seafaring communities. Some of those seafarers will show up again in the records of other peoples, as mercenaries, as settlers, as raiders, as new neighbours with unfamiliar customs. When you zoom out far enough, the end of palace life in Mycenaean Greece looks less like an isolated dark age and more like a pivot point. A highly centralised, tightly controlled world cracks. Out of those cracks spill smaller, tougher, more flexible communities that will, over centuries, reshape the map of the Eastern Mediterranean. Many of the groups that Egyptian scribes later try to pin down with neat, foreign-sounding names, many of the tribes and city-states that will populate the early Iron Age, are the descendants of people who once paid their taxes in grain and sheep to palace bureaucrats writing Linear B. Now, cut loose from that system, they are improvising new ways to live. And while that improvisation is happening on Greek hillsides and Aegean shores, something very similar is playing out on the opposite side of the sea, among the cities that line the Levantine coast, where merchant princes, port communities, and old vassal kings suddenly find themselves face to face with burning ships, failed harvests, and a world where the old guarantees no longer hold. If you sail east from Cyprus and turn south, you hit a coastline that, in the late 13th century BC, was one of the busiest corridors on Earth. From the Amarnes Mountains down past Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, all the way toward Ashkelon and Gaza, the Levantine shoreline is a chain of harbours and anchorages, with inland routes climbing up to the Hittite world, across to Mesopotamia, and down into Egypt. Think of it as the Bronze Age's main street. Copper and tin coming in, finished bronze going out, grain, wine, oil, timber, textiles, luxury goods flowing along it in both directions. And then, in the span of a few generations, that street fills with ruins. Archaeologists talk about destruction horizons here the way geologists talk about fault lines. You dig down through later layers, through Iron Age and classical and medieval occupations, and you hit a band of ash, collapsed walls, smashed storage jars, arrowheads embedded in stone. Over and over again, along this coast and just inland, you find moments where something violent and final happened. At Ugarit, up in what is now northern Syria, you've already seen the last letters, the king writing in panic as enemy ships appear. The archaeology lines up with that sense of suddenness. Buildings across the city show signs of fire. The royal palace, once full of tablets and luxury imports, ends in a blaze that seems to come quickly. There's no clear, long rebuilding phase afterward. The site is largely abandoned. Ugarit as an active, international port never really comes back. But move south and the pattern shifts. At Ras ibn Hani, a coastal villa complex just outside Ugarit, you see destruction, but you also see some later reuse and squatting among the ruins. At Tel Sukas, further down the coast, there's a late Bronze Age town with evidence of burning, followed in time by a smaller, poorer settlement. Inland at sites like Tel Afis and Hama, you get complicated sequences, late Bronze Age, palatial or administrative buildings, then horizons of destruction or heavy remodelling, then Iron Age levels where the architecture is more modest, the pottery different, the imported luxuries much rarer. Some places burn once, some burn, get partially rebuilt, and burn again. Some show no dramatic citywide fire at all, just gradual change, thick defensive walls going out of use, large storage complexes emptying, elite houses shrinking in size and quality. Farther south, in Canaan proper, the picture is just as patchy. Hazer, a major inland centre north of the Sea of Galilee, ends its late Bronze Age with a massive fire. The destruction layer is impressive: charred beams, cracked basalt, broken statues, smashed cult objects. The upper city's great palace is never rebuilt the way it was. Later occupants use parts of the site, but the old century-spanning administrative and ritual heart is gone. Megiddo, guarding routes across the Jezreel Valley, has its own late Bronze Age destruction layer, again with burnt debris, collapsed structures, changes in pottery and architecture above it. Yet Megiddo doesn't vanish. It's reoccupied, but what comes after looks different. New building plans, new fortification lines, different material culture. Lachish in the south shows a late Bronze Age town with Egyptian-style artifacts and Canaanite temples, followed by a striking destruction horizon. Afterward there's an Iron Age settlement with a different character, and at some point a new style of fortification, a big impressive gate system and casemate walls. Coastal cities like Ashkelon and Gaza also display breaks. Ashkelon's late Bronze Age levels end in destruction. On top of that, in the early Iron Age appear new building styles, new pottery forms, new diet patterns. Gaza, frustratingly, is harder to excavate systematically because of continuous occupation, but texts and scattered finds point to upheavals there too. If you zoom out, all these sites together don't give you a single neat storyline. They give you what you saw in Greece, a mosaic. Some centres are obliterated and largely abandoned. Some limp along. Some are refounded on a smaller scale. Some shift from being international ports plugged into Egypt, and Hatti's orbit to being local strongholds clinging to nearby farmland and whatever trade they can scrape together. Still, there is one big structural change that ties them all together. The old imperial umbrellas are collapsing. For centuries, much of this coast has been under the overlapping influence of two giants. To the north and northeast, Hatti, ruling from Hattusa, treats many Levantine cities as vassals or brothers, taking tribute, sending garrisons, arbitrating disputes. To the south, Egypt exerts its own power, especially over Canaan, stationing officials demanding grain and labour, carving victory scenes into temple walls to remind everyone who's supposed to be boss. These great powers don't control every hilltop, but they do set the rules. A Canaanite prince who gets too ambitious risks an Egyptian campaign. A coastal harbour that tries to cut Hittite merchants out of a timber deal can expect a stern tablet from the king in Hattusa, or worse, a march of troops down from the north. When Hatti falls apart and Egypt starts scrambling just to hold its northeastern frontier, that whole framework unravels. Letters from Ugarit during its final years show a king desperately trying to figure out who is still in charge, writing to the Hittites, to other vassals, to neighbouring rulers, and not getting clear answers. Egyptian inscriptions from roughly the same period start talking less about routine tribute and more about emergency defense, raiders on the delta, chaos in the foreign lands. On the ground, what that means is a power vacuum. In Canaan and along the Syrian coast, local rulers find themselves suddenly without a distant overlord to call on. Some try to step into the gap. In the early Iron Age, you see the emergence or strengthening of small kingdoms and city-states, Aram Damascus inland, new configurations in the Phoenician ports, shifting powers in the hill country. You also see a flurry of fortification activity. Late Bronze Age Canaanite cities often have walls, but in the 13th and 12th centuries you start getting evidence of hurried repairs, extra towers, new gateworks. Some hilltop sites that had been minor or unoccupied in the Palace Age suddenly sprout heavy defences and storage pits, as if people are retreating to more defensible positions, fortifying uplands away from vulnerable coastal plains. At places like Beth Shemesh and other smaller settlements, pottery and architecture suggest a move toward more compact, easily defended villages. In some valleys, older walled towns contract in size. People crowd into a fortified core, leaving outer areas empty. Elsewhere, entirely new sites appear in spots that are easily watched, easily defended, but not necessarily ideal for high-yield farming. Weaponry keeps pace with the mood. In Destruction Horizons and early Iron Age levels, you find more arrowheads, more spear points, more swords, often in forms and alloys that suggest changing technologies. Long slashing swords and leaf-shaped blades become more common. The shapes of shields and helmets that appear in some depictions and grave goods shift away from older chariot-centered elite warfare toward gear, better suited to close-quarters infantry fighting. Chariot warfare, the hallmark of late Bronze Age aristocratic battle culture, relies on stable, wealthy states with specialized training, horses, and large support systems for maintenance. As those systems crack, you see a tilt toward cheaper, more flexible infantry and makeshift defense. That doesn't mean chariots vanish overnight, but they're no longer the undisputed rulers of the battlefield. The social landscape is changing as well. One of the clearest and most debated signs of that change on the southern Levantine coast is the appearance of what archaeologists now call Philistine material culture. In the destruction layers at places like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and perhaps Gaza, the late Bronze Age town ends violently. On top of that debris, in the early 12th century BC, rise new neighbourhoods that look and feel different. Houses are built in different plans, sometimes in a kind of four-room style that will later become common in the region. The pottery suddenly includes forms and decorations that don't fit comfortably into the local Canaanite repertoire. Some of these new ceramics, often called Philistine bichrome ware, have shapes and painted motifs that strongly resemble Mycenaean and Cypriot styles of the late Bronze Age. Spirals, birds, stylized marine themes, red and black paint on lighter backgrounds, specific types of craters and bowls. Cooking installations also change. In some sites, large ovens and hearths appear that match Aegean-style cooking more than older Canaanite setups. Diet studies, things like animal bone analysis and residue in pots, suggest shifts in what people are eating and how they're preparing it. From the early 20th century onward, many scholars have read this as evidence of a foreign group arriving from the sea. The biblical texts mention Philistines in this region, in the early Iron Age. Egyptian inscriptions about the sea peoples name groups like the Peleset, who have often been equated, fairly or not, with those Philistines. Put it all together, and one influential interpretation goes like this. Bands of migrants or raiders with Aegean cultural roots seize or settle coastal Canaanite cities, install themselves as new elites, and bring their own pottery, cooking, and maybe language with them. But the closer you look, the messier it gets. For one thing, the new material culture is not a copy-and-paste job from any single Aegean region. It's a blend. You see echoes of Mycenaean Greece, of Cyprus, of local Canaanite forms, and perhaps of other, less well-understood traditions. Over time, the distinctly Aegean-looking elements fade, and what people are using and making becomes thoroughly Levantine again, just with some new flavours mixed in. Genetic studies, where they exist, hint at some non-local ancestry in early Iron Age individuals from this coast, but not in a way that screams total population replacement. Rather, they suggest incoming groups intermarrying with existing locals fairly quickly. And even the Egyptian texts, while dramatic, are not a photo of one clean invasion. When Rameses III boasts of having crushed the Peliset and their allies and settled some of them as strongholds for Egypt, he's describing a complicated mix of enemy fighters, potential mercenaries, families on ox carts, and resettlement policies. These people are not just faceless barbarians from over the sea, they're mobile groups whose identities are being formed in real time, by displacement, by alliance, by combat, by intermarriage. So when we call the early Iron Age occupants of Ashkelon or Gath Philistines, we're really talking about a process, not a static ethnicity. Some of the people in those cities may be descendants of Aegean-speaking mariners. Some may be Canaanite locals who adopted new habits and pottery styles because that's what the new elite liked. Some may be families from Cyprus or from Anatolian coastal towns, pushed around by earlier waves of chaos. Invaders in this world are often also settlers. Yesterday's raiding party might return next year with wives and children and oxen, intending to stay. Locals are not a pure, unchanging block either. Many of them have their own recent history of migration and alliance. When you look at the archaeological record without the comforting labels, what you see is an interwoven community of mixed origins figuring out how to live on a scorched coastline. And as these new and old communities jostle for space, the disappearance of reliable imperial protection reshapes everyday life. When a port like Ugarit or Ashkelon functions inside a stable Hittite-Egyptian sphere, merchants can plan. Grain imports from Egypt arrive more or less on schedule. Copper ingots from Cyprus show up in bulk. Ships from inland Syria bring timber and textiles. Harbour masters take customs. Palaces and temples store surplus. Artisans know what orders are coming months in advance. When that system fractures, all of those assumptions vanish. Excavations in some Levantine towns show a sharp drop in imported luxury goods after the destruction horizons. The proportion of locally made utilitarian pottery increases. Specialized workshops, ivory carvers, high-end bronze casters, luxury textile producers either disappear or shrink drastically. Storage facilities tell their own story. Fewer huge communal granaries, more small-scale household storage. That suggests people no longer trust distant palaces or overlords to redistribute fairly, or at all. They hold on to their own reserves when they can. Diet changes too. In some early Iron Age coastal sites, fish bones become more common, as if people are turning more heavily to the sea as agriculture inland becomes less reliable, or as trade in staples ebbs. In others, you see shifts in the balance between cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, reflecting new cultural preferences, new environmental pressures, or new groups moving in. For craftsmen, the world becomes riskier. A bronze worker, who once had a steady contract making weapons for an Egyptian garrison or a Canaanite prince, now has to hustle. Metal may be harder to get. Payments may be less secure. Some are probably drawn into direct participation in violence, making swords and spearheads for whoever can pay, or joining warbands themselves when orders dry up. Merchants face a sea that is at once more dangerous and more full of opportunity. Without big states patrolling routes, piracy spikes. But at the same time, if you've got the right connections and enough armed guards, you can make huge profits skirting the edges of collapsing regimes, trading with whoever is still standing. For ordinary farmers, herders, and fishers around these coastal cities, the impacts are more immediate and less romantic. Fields get burned in raids, livestock is stolen. Harvests that would once have been taxed and stored in royal granaries now have to be defended behind improvised walls or hidden away in pits. People move into fortified towns when they can, out into more remote or marginal lands when they must. Step back from the details, and the Levantine coast in the late 13th and 12th centuries BC looks less like a simple crime scene with a single culprit, and more like a fault zone where multiple pressures are converging: imperial collapse, climate stress, maritime raiding, refugee movements, local power grabs. Cities burn, yes, but others are rebuilt in new forms, by new mixtures of people. Fortifications grow taller. Pottery styles shift. Trade shrinks, then reorients. In the next part of this story, that shrinking and reorienting will hit one place especially hard: the island that had been the beating copper heart of the Bronze Age system. When the ports on the Levantine coast burn, the metal highway that ran through Cyprus doesn't just get potholes, it breaks. For most of the Bronze Age, if you wanted serious metal, you ended up dealing with one island, Cyprus. Its ancient names say it outright. In some texts it's Alashia, a kingdom in its own right. In others, it's almost shorthand for copper itself. The word copper in several ancient languages seems to trace back to Cyprus. When scribes in Egypt or Ugarit or Hatti talk about shipments of copper ingots, 9 times out of 10 they mean shipments from there. And that matters because bronze is not a single thing you just dig out of the ground. It's a recipe. You need copper and you need tin. Tin is rare, scattered in a few far-flung deposits. Copper is more common, but you still need large, easily mined, easily smelted sources to feed big states. The late Bronze Age superpowers solved that problem with a network. Tin from places like central Anatolia, or maybe even further afield. Copper from Cyprus. Palaces and merchants knit them together. So every chariot blade, every sword, every fancy inlaid dagger, gifted from one king to another, every axe used to fell timber for Egyptian ships, every bronze ploughshare turning soil in a Hittite field, every hinge, nail and tool in a palace workshop, it all depends on that recipe. Interrupt the flow of either ingredient, and the whole bronze system starts to wobble. Cyprus, sitting in the eastern Mediterranean like a stepping stone between Anatolia, Syria and Egypt, becomes the copper powerhouse that keeps the whole thing running. Archaeology backs that up. Late Bronze Age Cyprus is studded with mining and smelting sites. At places like Ugarit, you get big slag heaps, waste from smelting, that show industrial-scale production. Coastal centres like Enkomi, Kition and Hala Sultan Tekke turn that raw copper into standardised ingots, especially the iconic oxhide shape. Big flat bars with 4 protruding corners, easy to stack, easy to lash down in a ship's hold. We've literally pulled those ingots off the seafloor. The famous Uluburun shipwreck off the coast of southern Turkey dates to the late 14th century BC, before the big collapse. It carried around 10 tons of copper in oxide ingots, most of it almost certainly from Cyprus, plus about a ton of tin. That single ship held enough metal to manufacture thousands of weapons and tools. Multiply that by all the other ships that never sank, and you get a sense of how central this trade was. But by the time we reach the 13th and 12th centuries BC, something on Cyprus changes. The surface story looks familiar. Destruction layers, burned buildings, abandoned neighbourhoods, shifts in pottery and architecture. The details, though, hint at a complex, drawn-out upheaval, rather than a single apocalyptic moment. Take Enkomi on the east coast. In the 13th century, it's a major town. Gridded streets, big houses, workshops, stores of metal. Excavations show concentrated areas where copper was being worked. Casting, hammering, finishing. Then, in the late 13th or early 12th century, we hit a destruction horizon. Collapsed walls, evidence of fire, debris everywhere. But Enkomi doesn't just vanish. Parts of it are rebuilt, often on a different plan. Some streets shift. Certain quarters get abandoned while others grow. The same basic pattern repeats at other coastal sites. Hala Sultan Tekke shows phases of prosperity and international trade. Imports from Egypt, the Levant, the Aegean, followed by contraction and eventual abandonment. Kition goes through its own cycles of building, destruction, and reconfiguration. Even within the island, centres of gravity move. Some previously modest locations gain prominence, others lose it. Settlement patterns suggest people are not simply being wiped out, but they are moving around, consolidating, fortifying, changing where and how they live. At the same time, the export picture shifts. In the earlier late Bronze Age, Cypriot copper and pottery turn up everywhere. Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, the Aegean. Oxide ingots are almost a signature of the system. As we enter the 12th century, those classic ingots become rarer. Some shipwrecks from this period carry fewer ingots and more scrap metal. At several foreign sites, Cypriot imports decline or change in character. Instead of big bulk shipments, you start seeing more small-scale mixed cargoes or local copies of earlier Cypriot styles. In other words, the island that used to function as a stable copper pump for the whole region is sputtering. Why? Here, scholars line up a familiar spread of suspects: invasion, internal conflict, earthquakes, economic breakdown. Cyprus has enough evidence to support parts of all of them, but none of them by itself gives a clean, total explanation. One interpretation leans on invasion, often tied to the same broad phenomenon we call the Sea Peoples. Some destruction levels on Cyprus contain material that looks Aegean or foreign to earlier Cypriot tradition. Weapons, pottery forms, certain architectural changes. These have been read as signs of outsider groups attacking, settling, or seizing control of key ports. In this view, Cyprus is not just a victim, it's a prize. Control the copper, and you control a critical resource. So as palace systems strain, warbands, displaced groups, or ambitious rivals may have turned their attention to the island's wealth, leading to pitched battles, burned towns, and new elites installing themselves over old communities. But it doesn't have to be just overseas raiders. There's also the possibility of internal conflict. A place that wealthy is rarely politically simple. Multiple centres, in Komi, Kition, other towns, may each have had their own elites, their own ties to foreign powers, their own rivalries. When the big external patrons, Hatti, Egypt, Ugarit, start failing, the balance inside Cyprus could easily tip into civil war. Competing factions vying for mines, for harbours, for access to dwindling trade routes. Some destructions might represent local coups or punitive campaigns, not foreign invasions. Then add the Earth itself. The Eastern Mediterranean sits on active fault systems. Seismologists and archaeologists have proposed an earthquake storm in this era. A sequence of major quakes over decades, striking different parts of the region. On Cyprus, some collapsed buildings and distorted walls have been read as quake damage. In a normal era, a rich, stable palace system could rebuild after such shocks. In the late 13th and 12th centuries, when everything is already strained, an earthquake isn't just a natural disaster, it's a trigger. It can topple warehouses, crush workshops, destroy harbour installations, and then open the door for raids, famines, or internal revolts. Layered onto all of that is a more mundane but equally deadly possibility: economic crash. The copper business relies on buyers. If Hatti is fighting civil wars, if Ugarit is burning, if Levantine ports are turning inward just to survive, Cyprus's biggest customers are disappearing. Mines and smelters that once had steady orders might suddenly be stuck with stockpiles nobody can pay for or move. Specialists lose livelihoods. Local rulers lose revenue. That in turn can spark unrest, shifts in power, or simply a gradual hollowing out of the system. None of these factors excludes the others. They can stack. An earthquake damages a port. A rival faction takes advantage and attacks. Foreign raiders hit a weakened coastline. Meanwhile, broader regional trade shrinks, making every shock hurt more. What we see in the ground, burned layers, abandoned quarters, sudden architectural changes, is the fossilized residue of multiple overlapping crises. Whatever combination of causes you favour, the outcome is clear. Cyprus is not playing its old role anymore. For kingdoms on the mainland, that's not just a minor inconvenience, that's a structural failure. Imagine being a palace administrator in Mycenae, or in a Canaanite coastal city, or in a Hittite vassal town a century earlier. You keep tabs on copper shipments the way a modern logistics officer watches oil. You know when the next batch of ingots is due, how much tin is in storage, how many bronze spearheads you can commission. Your entire military budget, your ability to arm chariot drivers and infantry, your capacity to reward loyal nobles with gleaming weaponry and tools, it all depends on keeping that copper highway open. Now imagine that highway buckling. Ships that used to sail from Cyprus every season are delayed. Then one doesn't arrive at all. When a merchant finally limps in, he has half the expected cargo and a horror story. A burned town on the Cypriot coast, a harbour choked with wreckage, a rival warlord demanding special payments at a fortified headland, pirates prowling the usual routes. You can still get some metal, maybe from local scrap, maybe from small-scale traders willing to take insane risks. But the flow is no longer predictable, no longer cheap, no longer safe. What does that do to a Bronze Age army? Bronze is not just about flashy swords. It's spearheads, arrowheads, axe blades, armour fittings, chariot parts, tools for building fortifications and siege engines, rivets and nails for ships. When copper supplies get unreliable, you can't just switch overnight to something else. Iron is starting to appear in this period, but it's rare, difficult to work, often higher status than bronze at first, not a mass production replacement. So as copper from Cyprus falters, you get a slow crunch. Armories struggle to keep up. Old weapons are repaired and recycled instead of replaced. Palaces may cut back on issuing bronze tools to farmers and craftsmen, reserving the metal for military use. Elite chariot forces, those expensive, metal-hungry, maintenance-heavy units, become even more costly to support. That makes states more brittle. A run of bad years can now mean not just empty granaries, but also empty armories. Once palace elites can't reliably supply weapons and tools, their authority starts to look less divine and more contingent. Subjects notice when the promised gear doesn't arrive. Vassals notice when their overlord can't send the bronze and chariotry he once guaranteed. That weakens loyalty, encourages defections, opens room for local strongmen to arm their own followers with whatever they can scrape together. Maybe iron, maybe reworked bronze, maybe a mix. At the same time, maritime insecurity turns the whole eastern Mediterranean into a much riskier workplace. We have hints of this in the way shipwrecks change. Before the crash, we see big, well-equipped merchant vessels like Uluburun and Cape Caledonia plying long routes with mixed international cargoes. As the 12th century unfolds, there's less evidence of such grand, stable commerce. Routes fragment into shorter hops. Cargoes look more opportunistic, less standardized. The sea is still busy, but it's full of people sailing because they're desperate, not because business is booming. For Cyprus, that means fewer safe harbours abroad and more danger on the way out. A ship leaving Enkomi or Kition once had a set of relatively predictable options: Ugarit, Byblos, Ashkelon, Egyptian delta ports, southern Anatolian towns like Ura. Each had its own officials, its own taxes, its own patron kings, but they all played within a shared diplomatic framework. Now, some of those ports are smoking ruins. Others are under new management whose loyalty is unclear. Others still are so paranoid about raiders that they'll treat any unfamiliar sail as a threat. Insurance, in modern terms, goes through the roof. You need more guards, more weapons on board, more tribute ready to pay off coastal chiefs or makeshift harbour authorities. Voyages take longer. You avoid stretches of water known for piracy, hugging coastlines, slipping into minor inlets instead of grand harbours. Every extra day and every extra guard eats into profit. At some point, for some routes, the math just stops working. Better to sell copper locally, or not mine it at all, than to risk losing ship, cargo and crew to a combination of storms, pirates and hostile harbour masters. Zoom out, and Cyprus becomes the perfect example of what historians call a systems collapse. A systems collapse is not just one kingdom falling. It's when the interlocking networks that link many states, trade in key resources, diplomatic marriages, shared technologies, mutual defence agreements, specialist knowledge, start to unravel. Each failure amplifies others. Cyprus sits at a critical node in that network. It's not the only source of copper in the world, but for the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, it's the easiest, most developed, most tightly integrated one. When Cyprus convulses, when its ports burn, its settlements shift, its export patterns falter, the shock doesn't end at the coastline. It ripples. Ugarit, already shaky, suddenly can't count on regular copper for its armourers and merchants. Hatti, if it were still functioning, would see its supplies threatened, its chariot forces more expensive to maintain. Egyptian commanders on the Levantine frontier struggle to get enough metal for garrisons and tribute gifts. Smaller Canaanite and Syrian states, already squeezed by droughts and raids, now have to compete fiercely for whatever scraps of metal reach their shores, or turn inward and make do with less. Trade networks that used to move goods along long stable chains, Cypriot copper to Ugarit, Ugarit to inland Syria and Hatti, Egyptian grain up the coast, timber and oil and textiles flowing in all directions, start to break into segments. Some pieces keep working for a while, others seize up completely. Without the glue of reliable high-value commodities like copper, it becomes harder to justify and sustain long-distance relationships. And when long-distance relationships fail, information flow fails with them. News of raiders, of famines, of political shifts takes longer to travel. Warnings arrive too late. Appeals for aid go unanswered. Alliances fray. People on one shore have less and less idea what's really happening on the other. Rumours fill the gaps. Fear grows. From a distance of 3,000 years, it's tempting to picture the Sea Peoples as a single, coherent mystery army sweeping in and smashing everything. But if you look closely at Cyprus and its broken copper highway, you start to see something else. A cascading set of failures in a tightly coupled system. Raids and migrations, yes. Earthquakes, probably. Drought and famine, likely. Political fragmentation, definitely. But all of those shocks are made far more deadly by the fact that the region has tied its military power, its economic health, and its political prestige to a few key flows of goods. Copper from Cyprus is one of those flows. When that artery clogs, the Bronze Age body can't just shrug it off. It staggers, it improvises, it turns to iron, to local alternatives, to smaller, more isolated ways of living. In the chaos that follows, another landscape begins to move, the rugged, resource-rich highlands of Anatolia, where old powers are dying and new ones are testing their strength. Anatolia is where the map really starts to blur. If you look at a modern political map, it's clean. Turkey, borders, provinces. If you look at a late Bronze Age map of the same land, it's anything but. In the 14th and 13th centuries BC, Hittite royal scribes imagine Anatolia as a hierarchy. The great king in Hattusa at the top, vassal kings beneath him, petty lords beneath them, and so on. But that grand, neat pyramid exists mostly in archives and ideology. On the ground, Anatolia is a patchwork. In the north, along the Black Sea, there are people the Hittites call the Kaska. Forest dwellers, hill people, sometimes raiders, sometimes reluctant subjects. In the west, there's Arzawa, then Mira, Seha Riverland, Wilusa. Names that flicker in and out of Hittite tablets as allies, enemies, rebels, sometimes all three in the space of a generation. In the south, along the Mediterranean, there's Hattusa and various coastal cities whose loyalties shift as often as their rulers. Central Anatolia itself, Hatti proper, is dotted with smaller polities, temple domains, semi-independent towns. Ethnically, linguistically, culturally, it's mixed. Hittite, Luwian, Hurrian, probably other groups we only glimpse through personal names and place names. Some people live in walled towns on fertile plains. Others herd animals in highland pastures. Others still cling to fortified hilltops overlooking narrow passes. From a distance, it looks like a solid empire. Up close, it's a mosaic of micro-regions, each with its own local power structure, its own grievances, its own opportunities. That kind of landscape is manageable as long as the central power is strong, rich, and feared. When that power weakens, the same mosaic becomes a recipe for fragmentation. By the late 13th century, that's exactly what's happening. Hittite kings are fighting wars on too many fronts, against Egypt in Syria, against rebellious vassals in western Anatolia, against the Kaska in the north. They're struggling with famine. Letters from the period complain of grain shortages and pleading requests to Egypt for food. Royal succession is messy. Rival claimants, internal coups, assassinations. The great king's grip on those patchwork provinces starts to slip. Then, sometime near the beginning of the 12th century, Hattusa itself is abandoned and burned. The capital goes quiet. The clay tablets stop. The royal messengers stop riding. For decades afterward, in the written record of other regions, Hatti is mostly a memory. To Egyptians writing about the sea peoples, the Hittites are just one more fallen great power. To us, that moment is like someone shutting off the main light in a room full of smaller candles. But when a capital disappears, the land doesn't. The farms, the herds, the passes through the mountains, the copper and silver deposits, the old roads, they're all still there. So the obvious question is, who steps into the vacuum? This is where archaeology takes over from written history and where things get messy. Across western and southern Anatolia, right around the time Hattusa falls silent, we start seeing changes in settlement patterns. Some long-lived late Bronze Age towns shrink or are abandoned. New fortified sites appear, sometimes on higher ground, sometimes overlooking key routes. Pottery styles shift. In some areas, you see a break. Old Hittite or Hittite-influenced ceramics vanish and are replaced by different shapes, different decorations, sometimes more coarse, sometimes just different traditions. For example, in the region that will later become home to the Phrygians, you find a scattering of new sites in the early Iron Age, settlements with different material culture from the earlier Hittite horizon. In the southwest and along the Aegean coast, you see the rise of places that will one day be known as Caria and Lycia. On the Cilician Plain and the southern plateau, you get walled towns that later inscriptions will call Luwian or Neo-Hittite, small kingdoms like Carchemish, Melid, and others. Archaeologists look at this pattern: abandoned older centres, new fortresses, changed pottery, and sea movement. People shifting where they live, how they build, what they eat and store, who they trade with. But what kind of movement is it? That's where interpretations diverge. One reading says, migrations. As the Hittite central authority collapses, groups that had been held in check start to move. Mountain people from the north pushing south into former Hittite farmland. Western Anatolian groups expanding east once the royal armies stop patrolling. Maybe even outsiders from across the Aegean slipping into coastal valleys, taking over harbours and trading towns. Pottery that looks new or foreign becomes a fingerprint of incoming populations. Another reading is more cautious. Pottery can change for reasons that have nothing to do with mass migration. If trade routes shift, if workshops move, if elites fall, and new patrons favour different shapes or decorations, the ceramic record will change even if most people stay put. A new fortified hilltop town might represent a local community moving to a safer spot in unstable times, not a foreign takeover. Some archaeologists argue that what we're seeing in Anatolia is less like waves of invaders, and more like local societies reconfiguring themselves under stress. The truth may well sit in between. Some areas probably do see inflows of people, refugees from burned towns, defeated soldiers, displaced highland groups looking for food and security. Others might be mostly local reshuffling. What the evidence does agree on is that the old Hittite landscape is in motion. Think about the Casca in the north. For centuries, Hittite kings complain about them. They raid, they burn temples, they retreat back into the forests. With Hattusa gone, who's left to hold them back from pushing south into central Anatolia, or western vassal lands like Seha and Mira? Once they don't have to send tribute and chariots to the great king, what do their rulers do? Do they proclaim independence, fight each other, lead their own raids along the coast? In the south, along the routes that connect inland Anatolia to the Mediterranean, we start to see the rise of those so-called Syro-Hittite or Luwian kingdoms. Carchemish in particular seems to become a kind of successor state, preserving Hittite traditions for a while. That suggests some Hittite elites and their retainers escape the fall of Hattusa and relocate, taking their administrative skills, religious practices, and military experience with them. In other words, not everyone dies with the capital. Plenty of people move. Now plug these displaced, fragmented groups into the wider story of the Sea Peoples. When we read Egyptian inscriptions about invasions from the sea, it's tempting to imagine a single unified armada. Rows and rows of identical ships, one command structure, one master plan. But in a landscape like collapsing Anatolia, that picture feels less and less likely. Instead, imagine dozens of separate bands. Some are ex-Hittite soldiers whose pay has stopped, now following warlords instead of kings. Some are Casca raiders who've found new lowland targets. Some are Western Anatolian lords with their client warriors, no longer restrained by imperial treaties. Some might be mixed groups of locals and foreigners, drawn together by shared desperation rather than shared identity. Each band has its own leaders, its own goals, its own preferred routes. Some fight mainly on land, moving through mountain passes and along old caravan roads. Others hug the coast, maybe even commandeering ships from coastal towns. A few might be genuinely seafaring, groups comfortable enough on the water to raid islands and vulnerable ports. This is where Anatolia's geography becomes crucial. Look at a physical map, not a political one. The peninsula is a backbone of highlands cut by narrow river valleys, with a central plateau behind multiple mountain chains. To move large groups, whether merchants, armies or refugees, you need specific corridors. There's the route from the central plateau down to the Cilician plain, essential for linking inland Anatolia to Syria and the Levant. There are passes through the Taurus Mountains that connect the interior to the Mediterranean coast. There are inland roads that run parallel to the Aegean and South Anatolian coast without ever needing a ship. Control those passes and roads, and you don't have to dominate the sea to have serious military and economic power. If Hittite garrisons that used to guard those choke points are gone, those routes are suddenly up for grabs. Local chiefs who can muster a few hundred fighters and hold a pass can tax, block or raid nearly everything that moves through. Caravans that once travelled under the protection of imperial authority now have to negotiate, bribe or fight their way along. Some of those local chiefs might start as toll collectors and end as full-blown raiders. From the perspective of a coastal city in Cyprus or the Levant, what does that look like? You send caravans inland for timber, horses, metals, slaves. Fewer come back. The ones that do have stories, ambushes in the passes, villages ransacked, strange war bands appearing from the hills. You don't necessarily know who these attackers are in ethnographic terms. You just know there are people from the mountains or men from Hatti or raiders making the overland routes unsafe. At the same time, some of these inland groups may start moving outwards. If the plateau is ravaged by famine or conflict, if towns are burning and stores are empty, then following the roads and rivers downhill makes sense. You go where the food and wealth are, coastal plains, harbours, rich delta lands. Sometimes you come as supplicants, asking for land, grain, or employment as mercenaries. Sometimes you come with weapons out. So when Egyptian scribes describe a coalition of peoples coming from the islands in the midst of the sea and their hearts confident, they may be compressing a much more complex reality. Multiple streams of displaced and opportunistic groups, some arriving by ship, others by land, all converging on the richest, softest parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Anatolia in this picture isn't just a victim of the sea peoples, it's a factory for them. Yet even here, the evidence resists neat labels. In many Anatolian sites associated with this period, we can see disruption, but we can't always see culprits. Fortified towns show burn layers, storage jars are smashed, some houses are abandoned half lived in, with everyday objects left where they fell. Afterward, new people move in, sometimes rebuilding along similar lines, sometimes changing the street plan, sometimes starting fresh elsewhere. But the destruction layers don't come with little tags saying, "These were Casca raiders," or "This was a Mycenaean war band," or "This was a starving local revolt." The pottery that follows might show continuity, suggesting locals rebuilding, or it might show change, suggesting new influences. Even then, influence might mean trade, fashion, or an exchange of potters, not a conquering army. Sound familiar? It's the same ambiguity we saw on Cyprus, now transplanted to the rugged highlands and interior plains. We can say with confidence that Anatolia in the early 12th century BC is full of movement. People displaced by the fall of Hattusa, by local wars, by failing harvests, by collapsing trade. We can say there are new fortified sites, changing pottery, and a breakdown of the old imperial framework. We can say that this creates perfect conditions for raiding, migration, and the rise of small aggressive polities. What we can't do is draw a single, straight line from Anatolian chaos to Sea People's Armada as if it's one organised project. The more closely we look, the more it looks like a swarm. Bands of fighters coming down from the north, local lords in western Anatolia playing both sides between Aegean and inland powers, ex-Hittite officers selling their skills to whoever can pay, refugee families trailing behind armed groups hoping for security, merchants turning into pirates when overland routes fail, small coastal towns turning into raiding bases because there's no other way to survive. On a map, that swarm is shaped as much by land routes and mountain passes as by sea lanes. Some lines run along the coast in ships, others run inland through gorges and over ridges. When those lines cross in places like the Cilician Plain, the Gulf of Antalya, the Aegean littoral, you get hotspots where the archaeological record shows exactly what we'd expect. Burned layers, abrupt cultural shifts, new settlement patterns, and yet the inscriptions and letters that survive from outside Anatolia mostly talk in broad strokes. Men from foreign lands, those who came from the sea, the land of Hatti is laid waste. They give us the big picture, collapse, invasion, movement, without the fine-grained detail of who is doing what where. So Anatolia becomes both crucial and elusive. It's a source region for some of the unrest that crashes into Cyprus, the Levant and Egypt. It's a corridor for land-based raiders who never need to set foot on a ship to cause havoc. It's a graveyard for an empire and a cradle for the small Iron Age kingdoms that will follow. But it refuses to resolve into one clean story of one mystery army. Instead, it gives us something more unsettling. A landscape in which dozens of separate crises and ambitions overlap, intersect and feed on each other. That's the environment from which the Sea People's mythos emerges. Not a single marching column, but a moving, shifting frontier where the difference between soldier, bandit, refugee and pirate might be a matter of context more than identity. And somewhere along those passes and coasts, some of those bands meet organised resistance. Not on stone reliefs yet, not in mythic battles carved on temple walls, but in the day-to-day clashes we can barely glimpse. Ambushes on narrow tracks, skirmishes over wells, hastily fortified hilltops under siege. To imagine how those fights actually looked, what it meant to face this fragmented storm of people in real combat, We have to turn from maps and pottery to spears, chariots, and the bleeding edge of Bronze Age warfare. If you were standing on one of those battlefields, the first thing you'd notice is that it doesn't look like a Hollywood phalanx or a medieval charge. Late Bronze Age warfare is still built around a very particular machine, the chariot. For the big kingdoms, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, the Canaanite city-states, a chariot is not just a fancy taxi. It's the centerpiece of elite warfare, a light wooden frame, spoked wheels, drawn by a pair of horses that have been trained, fed and groomed like Formula One race cars. On top, usually 2 men, sometimes 3, a driver and an archer, occasionally a shield bearer. On a flat plain, the kind you get in the Nile Delta, the Cilician Plain, around Megiddo in some of the big river valleys of Syria, that combination is terrifying. The driver weaves in and out, keeping enough distance to avoid infantry spears. The archer fires composite bows that can punch through armour at impressive ranges. Dozens, hundreds of these chariots moving together, wheels rattling, horses screaming, arrows raining down. That's the elite battlefield that the great kings write about in their annals and carve onto their temple walls. But those chariots are fragile in their own way. They hate rough ground. Stones break wheels, mud bogs down horses, steep slopes are a nightmare, and they're expensive. Maintaining a chariot core means stable complexes, craftsmen who can repair wheels and axles, specialists breeding and training horses, stores of fodder. It's basically a mobile piece of palace infrastructure. Now drop that world into the early 12th century BC, when the palace systems that support those chariot forces are starting to wobble, and when more and more armed groups are not neat lines of state troops but mixed bands of land raiders, ex-soldiers, and would-be settlers. Imagine an Egyptian field army scrambling north because word has reached the court. Foreigners are burning ports along the Levantine coast, threatening the grain and timber routes the delta depends on. The scribes describe Ramses III marching with thousands of infantry and hundreds of chariots. Behind the rhetoric, you can glimpse the practical logic. In front, light infantry and scouts, maybe some local Canaanite allies, trying to find where these raiding parties are actually moving. In the centre, the chariot arm, ready to deploy wherever there's flat enough ground to make use of them. Mixed among the infantry, archers with long composite bows, slingers, men with javelins and thrusting spears, all protected to varying degrees by linen or leather armour and small round or rectangular shields. On the other side, the people we lazily call sea peoples probably don't have anything like that level of standardised equipment. Some do: former palace guards, defected mercenaries, ex-Hittite or Mycenaean soldiers who kept their bronze cuirasses, their helmets, their training. Others are in quilted or padded garments, maybe a piece of bronze scale sewn onto a leather backing. Some are basically just tough farmers with a spear, a wooden shield, and whatever they've been able to loot along the way, and crucially they're not just warriors. The Egyptian inscriptions make a point of this. These groups are coming with their families, with their possessions, their women and children in carts. That phrase changes the whole mental picture of the battlefield. Think of a raiding column stretching down a dusty road. In the front, a vanguard of fighting men, maybe a few mounted scouts. Then carts and wagons, anything with wheels that can carry grain, tools, kids, old people, and whatever they've stolen from the last town. Around them, more fighters guarding the flanks and the rear. It's less like a professional army on campaign, and more like an armed caravan, or even a mobile village. Is that plausible in the late Bronze Age? A lot of historians think some version of it is. We have parallels. Indo-European migrations on the Eurasian steppe. Later groups like the Cimmerians and Scythians. Even the Germanic migrations that will trouble Rome centuries in the future. When whole communities move with their warriors, you get exactly this kind of warrior-migrant pattern: columns of carts, families behind lines of fighters, a built-in incentive to find not just loot but land. But it's probably not the only pattern. Some sea peoples groups may have been much more like conventional mercenary bands, professional or semi-professional fighters who had long experience serving foreign kings. The late Bronze Age is full of this kind of hired muscle: Mycenaean spearmen fighting in Syria, Sheridan and other groups serving as guards in Egypt before they ever appear as enemies. Hittite records that mention foreign charioteers and men of the sea used as garrison troops. This mercenary world creates a blur between state army and invader. The same man might fight for a Hittite king one year, raid the king's former vassals the next, and accept land from an Egyptian pharaoh as a reward the year after that. Loyalty follows rations and plunder more than flags or ethnicity. So picture a battle line forming near a coastal town. On one side, a local ruler, maybe a Canaanite prince under Egyptian protection, has scraped together his own troops. A handful of chariots if he's lucky, some armoured retainers with bronze swords and long spears, and a mass of poorer freemen furnished with simpler gear. He may also have called in mercenaries, Sheridan or other foreign warriors who fight as heavy infantry with big round shields and horned helmets, men who know how to stand firm when chariots approach. On the other side, a mixed group of attackers. Some are essentially pirates, light infantry used to fast coastal raids, throwing javelins, firing arrows, looting and leaving. Some are those warrior migrants with their families parked a few miles inland. Maybe a handful of them even bring captured chariots, though probably without the full training and support to use them like a big kingdom would. The key is terrain and timing. If the defenders can force a fight on open ground, with time to deploy, their chariots and organised ranks have an advantage. Those wooden fortifications, mud brick walls and city gates in the background are meant to keep raiders from simply walking into the storehouses. Siege warfare in this period is ugly and slow. Battering rams, fires set at gates, attempts to undermine walls, cutting off water supplies. That favours defenders if they can keep being resupplied. But if the attackers can choose when and where they fight, everything changes. The Egyptian reliefs from Medinet Habu show one scenario the Egyptians wanted you to see: naval combat. Ramses III's artists carve ships locked together, Egyptian archers standing on deck firing down into enemy vessels, grappling hooks and chaos, foreign ships tipping over as their crews tumble into the water. We can't treat those panels as CCTV footage, but they're not pure fantasy either. At minimum, they tell us what Egyptians thought naval combat looked like, or wanted to claim it looked like. Take those images apart. The ships are relatively small by later standards, oared galleys with a single sail. To fight from them, archers need room to stand and shoot. Grappling hooks imply a tactic. Close with the enemy, entangle their boats, turn the fight into a boarding action where elite infantry skills matter. If you can pin an enemy vessel under your bows, your archers can shoot down at a dense trapped target. If you can disable their oars or cut their rigging, you've turned their mobility into a floating coffin. Now imagine that not as a staged scene on a temple wall, but as a moving, uncertain reality in a crowded delta. A flotilla of migrant ships enters a river mouth hoping to push inland. Egyptian patrol boats, perhaps guided by local pilots, know the channels. They try to hem the intruders in between banks and sandbars. The wind shifts. Oars bite water. Men are yelling in languages that neither side fully understands. Arrows begin to fly. If you're one of those would-be invaders, you're not just worried about dying in battle. You're worried about what happens if your ship is sunk and your children are on board the next one in line. You might lash vessels together for stability, cluster the non-combatants toward the rear, stack shields along the gunwales. All of those things show up, in stylized form, in the Egyptian depictions. And if you're Egyptian, you're not just shooting at warriors, you're trying to break the entire moving ecosystem of these groups, to scatter ships, sink baggage, force survivors to beach their vessels in panic, where your chariots and infantry can finish the job on land. Again, this is a model, not a transcript. We don't know how many such encounters there were. The reliefs compress multiple incidents into one triumphal story: the pharaoh who stopped them at the mouth of the river and destroyed them in their entirety. But within the propaganda you can still see tactics: river ambush, combined land-sea operations, deliberate use of fortified points to channel and contain enemy movement. Zoom out from the set-piece battles the kings brag about and you get a continuous spectrum of violence. On the smallest scale, an ambush in a mountain pass. A caravan of pack animals escorted by a dozen armed men, picked off by a warband that knows the rocks and gullies. The goal isn't to conquer territory, it's to take goods, grain, tin, copper, textiles, people, fast, and disappear before a larger force can respond. A step up, a raid on a coastal town. The attackers know from informants, merchants, disgruntled locals, ex-garrison soldiers, that tonight the harbour is full, that the town's main force is away, that the watch is lax. Boats slide in before dawn. Ladders go up. Maybe a gate is opened from inside. There's fire, panic. people fleeing, some fighters making a desperate stand in a temple courtyard or palace forecourt. The attackers grab what they can carry: metal ingots, stored grain, portable luxury goods, captives. Then they're gone, back to sea or up into the hills. Multiply that pattern along a coastline studded with palace-controlled harbours, and you can see why these raids are so deadly to the underlying economic system. Late Bronze Age palaces don't just live off local peasants. They're the clearinghouses for long-distance trade. Copper arrives from Cyprus, tin from somewhere further east, grain from rich delta lands, timber from the mountains, finished goods and luxury items shuttling back and forth. Interrupt that flow even intermittently. Burn a harbour here, scare away merchant fleets there, make inland roads so dangerous that caravans need triple guards, and the palace's main reason for existing begins to erode. It can't guarantee trade. It can't collect the same level of taxes or tribute. It can't feed its dependent specialists, scribes, smiths, charioteers, priests, administrators. The army that once deterred raiders shrinks, and with it, the ability to keep raiders at bay. It's a feedback loop. This is why coastal raids can topple palace economies without anyone ever planting a new flag on the walls. You don't have to conquer the countryside in the modern sense. You just have to make key nodes, ports, depots, crossroads, so insecure that the finely tuned system they feed starts to stutter and stall, and into those gaps step mercenaries again. A palace desperate to protect its harbour might hire some of the very groups that have been attacking neighbouring towns. We will give you grain, land, and a cut of the customs duties if you fight for us instead of against us. Suddenly, yesterday's pirates are today's port police. From the ground, that means the same familiar horned helmets or distinctive shields now appear on the walls of your city as defenders instead of attackers. For outside observers, Egyptian scribes maybe, or later storytellers, that's one more reason why lines between sea peoples, foreign settlers, and Egyptian troops blur. All of this, the chariots, the infantry, the ship-to-ship grappling, the warrior migrants with their carts, the mercenaries swapping employers, gives us a toolkit to imagine what those battles might have looked like. But it also tempts us into overconfidence. We can model likely tactics because we know the weapons, we know the terrain, we know how similar societies behave under stress. We can read the inscriptions, study the shipwrecks, dig the burned layers in coastal towns, and fit them into plausible scenarios. Here a naval skirmish, there a surprise raid, somewhere else a pitched battle on a river plain. What we can't do is narrate the 12th century equivalent of a play-by-play. We don't know which warband fired the first arrow at which harbour. We don't know whether an ex-Hittite officer commanded that mixed group of migrants who tried and failed to force a river mouth in the delta. We don't know, for any given burned palace or toppled wall, whether the final blow came from invaders, local rebels, or a starving garrison that turned on its own rulers. Later, myth and memory will simplify this chaos into clean stories. A single people, a single invasion, single great victories and defeats. The reality, as far as we can see, is a series of overlapping fights, raids, blockades, and ambushes that gradually grind down the old order. And when we step back from the smoke and shouting and look again at the wider landscape, shrinking harvests, shifting storm tracks, earthquakes, we start to see that these battles, as dramatic as they are just one layer of a much larger crisis. The climate itself may be turning against the Bronze Age. When historians say the climate itself may be turning against the Bronze Age, that's not just a poetic line. It comes from some very literal mud and rock. Over the last few decades, scientists have been coring lakes all around the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, tiny floating platforms, long hollow drills, pulling up thin cylinders of mud laid down year after year for thousands of years. To a climate scientist, those cores are time machines. Each layer records what washed into the lake that season: dust from distant deserts, ash from fires, microscopic shells from algae, and pollen from plants growing around the shore. Pollen is especially important. Olive trees, wheat, barley, wild grasses, pine, oak, they all produce pollen grains shaped in slightly different ways, like microscopic fingerprints. Under a microscope, you can literally count which plants were shedding most at a given time. More cereal pollen? That usually means more fields under cultivation, more steppe grasses and shrubs. That suggests drier conditions, less farming, more open, degraded landscapes. Then there are speleothems, stalagmites and stalactites in caves. Picture a drip of water falling from a cave roof, leaving behind a hair-thin ring of mineral as it evaporates. Ring after ring, decade after decade, building up those familiar cave pillars. The chemistry of each ring changes depending on how much rain fell above the cave, how long the water sat in the soil, what it dissolved on the way down. By drilling a core through a stalagmite and measuring tiny variations in oxygen isotopes, scientists can reconstruct wet and dry periods with surprising precision. Put those lines of evidence together, lake mud, cave rock, plus tree rings from the very few ancient timbers we have, and a broad pattern emerges. Between roughly 1250 and 1100 BC, across parts of the eastern Mediterranean, there is a signal of drying. Not an instant switch from green to desert, but a shift. Fewer years of generous rain, more frequent and intense droughts, a higher chance that any given harvest would be disappointing or disastrous. Now, drought in a pre-industrial palace-run system isn't just, it didn't rain enough this year. It's more like pulling bricks out of the base of a very tall, very wobbly Jenga tower. Late Bronze Age kingdoms are built on predictable surplus. Peasants sow grain. If the rains behave, a portion of that harvest goes to support the farmer's family, a portion is held back as seed for next year, and a big slice, taken in kind as actual physical sacks of barley or wheat, goes up the chain as tax or tribute. That grain feeds palace personnel, temple staffs, garrisons, and especially the one group that does not produce its own food, the professional fighting class. Armies in this world are economically giant walking mouths. Charioteers, retainers, foreign mercenaries, garrison troops in far-flung towns, they all have to be fed. That food isn't conjured from nothing. It's diverted through a sophisticated taxation and redistribution system from the countryside to central storehouses and then back out again. Now run a few bad years in a row. The first bad year, the palace orders emergency measures. Temples open their granaries. The crown remits or reduces taxes in the worst-hit districts. Maybe grain is shipped along the coast from regions that had slightly better weather. You see this kind of response centuries later in Assyrian and Egyptian texts, so it's a safe bet something similar happened earlier. The second bad year, the elasticity is already gone. Temple storerooms are low. The surplus that was meant to be seed is eaten. Livestock get culled. The palace has to make hard choices. Do you keep feeding the full army, or do you keep city populations quiet by providing ration distributions? Do you keep supplying your distant vassal or frontier garrison, or do you pull them back and risk losing that territory for now? In a world of strong central control, losing that buffer of surplus even temporarily is dangerous. Tax compliance becomes negotiable. If the king's collectors arrive demanding the same quota after a failed harvest, peasants cannot comply without starving. Local elites, mayors of towns, landholding nobles, semi-independent princes, find themselves in a bind. Do they squeeze their people and send grain to the capital, hoping the king will reward their loyalty? Or do they quietly hold back, stockpile, and think about what happens if the central power weakens? You can feel the political chemistry changing. Armies that aren't being paid and fed start to look for other sponsors. Mercenaries drift. Vassals hedge their bets. Rebels, bandits, and local strongmen often emerge precisely when the central state can no longer reliably turn grain into loyalty. This is where the drought hypothesis slots into the story of the collapse. It doesn't say it stopped raining, therefore empires fell overnight. It says, a long swing toward drier conditions made all the key systems, taxation, food supply, military provisioning, fragile. Once fragile, they were far more vulnerable to every other stress, raids from the sea, internal succession disputes, frontier wars, epidemics, you name it. Parallel to the drought arguments, another environmental suspect has entered the scene: earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean is laced with fault lines. Greece, western Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant. All of these sit in tectonically active zones, where the African, Eurasian and Arabian plates grind against each other. Today, that means regular quakes. There's no reason to think the Late Bronze Age had it any easier. Archaeologists working in places like Mycenae, Tiryns, Troy, and various Levantine cities have noticed something. Certain destruction layers show collapsed walls, fallen columns, crushed bodies under tumbled masonry, but not much evidence of fire. In some buildings, stones have shifted in distinctive ways that suggest sudden shaking rather than deliberate demolition. A few sites even have what look like repeated episodes of quake damage and repair over a century or two. This has given rise to the idea of an earthquake storm, not in the Hollywood sense of a magical line of CGI faults exploding one after another, but in the geologic sense of a period when stress along a network of faults is released in a series of large events spaced over decades. One big quake on a segment can redistribute strain and make others more likely for a time. Over, say, 50 to 100 years, you might get a cluster of severe earthquakes scattered across a region. If you plot some of the most likely quake-damaged sites on a map, they do fall along known fault zones. So some researchers have argued that part of the Late Bronze Age collapse is simply that, a bad century to be building heavy stone palaces along active faults. But this is where the evidence gets tricky. An earthquake doesn't leave a neat label in the layer that says, "Hi, I am a 7.5 magnitude event from June 1192 BC. Destruction by quake and destruction by war or accidental fire can overlap or be misread. A city can be badly shaken, its walls cracked, its roofs fallen, and then, in the chaos that follows, it can be looted or burned by opportunists. Months or years later, an invading army might come through and finish the job. By the time we dig down 3,000 years later, the sequence is compressed into a few centimetres of ash, rubble, and smashed pottery. On top of that, there is the dating problem. Even with the best radiocarbon calibration and careful stratigraphy, pinning specific destructions to specific decades can carry an uncertainty of a few decades either way. To prove that a chain of cities were all knocked down by the same earthquake storm, rather than by different causes at different times, you'd need better resolution than we generally have. So we're left with probabilities. Some sites almost certainly fell to earthquakes, others clearly burned in ways that scream siege and fire. Many may show a messy combination of both. Rather than imagining a single apocalyptic seismic episode that destroyed the Bronze Age, it may be more realistic to see earthquakes as another kind of hammer in that whack-a-mole game, occasionally smashing a palace or town already stressed by other factors. Where climate and tectonics really matter, though, is in how they shape human behaviour, especially movement and conflict. If you are a peasant on marginal land, a hillside plot that just barely produces enough in good years, drought is an existential threat. After 3 or 4 bad seasons, your options narrow. Sell your livestock, then your tools, then maybe your own freedom, entering into debt bondage under a wealthier landowner who can keep you alive in exchange for your labour. If that safety net doesn't exist, or if it's already overloaded, you start to move into valleys, toward rivers, toward cities and forts where grain is stored, toward regions rumoured to have been less badly hit. Multiply that by tens of thousands of people across multiple kingdoms, and you get migration pressure. Crowded river valleys and plains see waves of new arrivals, hungry, desperate, and not always welcome. Local landholders resist sharing their fields. City gates become choke points. Tensions between old residents and newcomers rise, whether those newcomers are technically fellow subjects of the same king or not. On top of that, palace economies themselves are relocating grain. When harvests fail in one region, but the king still owes rations to soldiers, scribes, and craftsmen, grain is moved along roads and sea lanes from better-off districts to worse-off ones. That concentrates food in particular hubs, port towns, royal store cities, fortified depots. To a migrating group or a displaced warband, those hubs look like lifelines and targets at the same time. If you can secure a share of that grain, by negotiation, by service, or by force, your people survive. If you're turned away, your children starve. That's a powerful incentive to push, bargain hard, and if necessary, fight. Earthquake damage compounds this pressure in subtler ways. A big quake can destroy irrigation works, dam up rivers, change water tables. Fields that were watered before might dry out. Others might flood. A palace that once organised canal cleaning, embankment repairs, and seasonal water management might simply not have the resources to rebuild. Local communities, left on their own, patch what they can, abandon what they can't, and sometimes move. Once again, mobile people meet immobile storehouses and conflict follows. We can imagine scenarios like this. A city takes heavy quake damage. Its walls crack, some towers collapse, a portion of the population flees. The central power, already juggling drought and foreign war, cannot spare the men or materials to fully restore its defences. Word spreads along caravan routes and among coastal raiders. That place is weak. Maybe its elite families start fighting for control of what's left. Maybe a neighbouring king decides this is the time to settle an old score. By the time the archaeologist arrives thousands of years later, what they find is a layer of destruction with both structural collapse and burned rubble. Was the quake the killer, or just the opening act? Hard to say. But it clearly made everything that followed easier. This is why many scholars today talk about the environmental factors as amplifiers rather than prime movers. Drought, earthquakes, possible shifts in storm tracks that affect sailing seasons. All of these raise the stakes and lower the margin for error. They don't, by themselves, create war bans, palace coups, or mass migrations, but they make those things more likely to turn systemic. In a stable, well-provisioned world, a serious earthquake might be a tragedy but not a civilization ender. The state mobilizes, rebuilds, and even uses the disaster to display its power and generosity. In a world where harvests are already unreliable, trade routes are already plagued by raiders, and palaces are struggling to pay their troops, the same earthquake can be the straw that breaks the system's back. And here's the twist. When you look back from 3,000 years away, compounded stresses can look like a single sudden catastrophe. In the stratigraphy, multiple events collapse into what appears to be one sharp break. The last late Bronze Age layer, then ashes and rubble, then centuries of simpler pottery styles and smaller settlements. To the archaeologist's trowel, that's collapse. To the people living through it, it was probably a drawn-out grind of bad harvests, rising taxes, unpaid soldiers, faction fights, newcomers at the gate, shaky walls, and then finally, flames. So when we ask, was it climate? Was it earthquakes? Was it the sea peoples? The unsatisfying but increasingly plausible answer is yes, in some combination. Climate stress seems to have narrowed the economic base. Earthquakes damaged key nodes. Those stresses pushed people to move, to fight over food, to look for new patrons or new lands. Raiders and migrant warriors exploited the cracks. Palaces that might have weathered one crisis at a time instead took several at once. The late Bronze Age didn't fall because rain stopped, or because the earth shook on a particular Tuesday. It fell because a finely balanced, highly interconnected system ran into a cluster of shocks it could not absorb. And in the turbulence that followed, ships full of families, armies without paymasters, cities half rebuilt and half abandoned, the Mediterranean became a sea full of people looking for safety, for loot, for land. Which is where the story of piracy, refugees, and that mysterious sea people's label really begins. Out on that restless water, the categories start to blur. If you're a scribe in a palace office, it's easy to write enemy ships, pirates, invaders from the sea. Words on clay are clean and sharp. But if you zoom in to the level of one deck, one hull crashing through the swell toward a vulnerable harbour, the picture looks different. Maybe half the men on board are professional fighters, mercenaries whose last employer stopped paying when the drought bit too deep. They still have their gear, bronze swords, spears, helmets passed down from older campaigns. The other half are not professional anything. They're farmers who sold their ploughs, fishermen from a ruined cove, teenage boys who have never been this far from shore. They carry whatever weapons they could get, old axes, hunting bows, cooking knives lashed to poles. They're not on that ship because they love glory. They're there because there was no grain left at home. This is one of the most important shifts to grasp about the so-called sea peoples. It may not have been a neat, ethnically uniform navy of doom sailing out to conquer. Many scholars now suspect that at least some of these groups were exactly what you would expect to see in an age of cascading disaster. Displaced coastal communities hitching their fates to whatever leaders could still promise food and protection. Think about the geography. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean is ringed with small harbours and villages that cling to the edge between land and sea. These are not the grand palaces, they're the satellite communities that feed them. Fishing towns, shipbuilding coves, minor ports where surplus grain and copper ingots are loaded onto coastal freighters. When palace systems weaken, when tribute shipments stop, when garrisons withdraw, when central storage fails, these marginal places are exposed first. A fishing village that once paid tax to the nearest king in exchange for protection might suddenly find that the tax collector still comes, but the warships do not. The same drought that cripples inland farms erodes nearshore fishing too. Fewer river nutrients in the water, altered spawning runs, storms at the wrong time of year. Add in the occasional earthquake-triggered wave or subsidence that ruins a harbour, and the local economy can collapse almost overnight. What do you do if you live there? You can try to move inland, but the farmers there are already under pressure and not eager to share. You can swear loyalty to a new overlord if one comes by, but in a time of rapid political breakdown those overlords are unreliable. Or you can do something both logical and dangerous, take to the sea yourselves and look for a better deal. Under those conditions, piracy isn't a cultural trait. It's a business model that emerges when all the others have failed. The pattern turns up in many eras. When centralized authority weakens and trade still flows, groups on the margins often turn to raiding as an economic strategy. You see it with Viking bands along the coasts of early medieval Europe, with privateers in the Caribbean when Spain's grip loosens, with sea bandits in the South China Sea in times of dynastic crisis. The mechanics are similar, armed men in boats, targeting points where high-value goods are concentrated and lightly defended. The difference in the late Bronze Age is scale and desperation. This isn't a handful of adventurous youths going a Viking for a season and then returning home with loot. Home, for many people, barely exists anymore. Fields are failing, harbour installations are cracked from quakes, palaces that once bought fish and timber with good silver are blackened ruins. So the people in those boats bring more than weapons. They bring their families. Ancient reliefs and letters hint at this. Egyptian records talk about enemies coming from the midst of the sea with their wives and children in carts. At first glance, that image, ox carts rolling along the shore piled high with belongings, trundling behind or ahead of columns of fighters, sounds like overblown propaganda. Look closer, and it echoes something very familiar, scenes we've seen in our own time whenever war, famine or collapse pushes civilians onto the roads. The same logic extends to the water. If your only remaining asset is a seaworthy hull and a crew who knows the currents, why leave your family in a doomed village? You load them on board. We can imagine deck space crowded not only with warriors, but with women carrying infants, with children wedged among amphorae and jars, with goats and a few precious cattle tethered along the gunwales. Ships that once ferried copper, timber and wine now carry entire communities. This is where the line between refugee convoy and invasion fleet dissolves completely. To the people inside the system, these arrivals look like both at once. They are strangers in substantial numbers, armed, hungry and mobile. They can fight, but they also need food and land. If you're a local ruler watching them sail toward your coast, you don't have a neat category for that. You have a problem. Famine and political collapse don't just produce hungry mouths, they also reorganize violence. Professional soldiers, as we saw, are utterly dependent on the palace for food. Once that pipeline breaks, their skills become free-floating. Some become bodyguards for surviving elites. Some drift into banditry. Some sign up with charismatic leaders who promise a new deal. Maybe a chieftain from the highlands, maybe a foreign prince, maybe an ambitious ship captain who claims divine favour and a knack for navigation. Attach those loose fighters to displaced coastal groups, and you get something potent: armed migration. An armed migrant group is not an army in the bureaucratic sense. It doesn't have standardized equipment, or a permanent barracks, or a treasury. It's a coalition, often ad hoc, made up of many fragments. A defeated garrison, a band of dismissed mercenaries, fishermen whose nets have rotted, villagers driven out by raiders, younger sons with no land to inherit. It can raid like a pirate crew, fight like a war band, or bargain like a delegation, depending on what its leaders think will work. The archaeological record offers hints of this messy mix. In destruction levels associated with the collapse, weapon styles are oddly varied. At some sites you find classic Mycenaean-type swords, alongside forms more typical of central Anatolia or the Levant. Arrowheads and spear points don't all match the local tradition. Some come from moulds used hundreds of kilometres away. It doesn't look like a neat uniform state army fighting another neat uniform state army. It looks like patchwork. The same goes for ships. The famous Medinet Habu reliefs in Egypt depict enemy vessels with distinctive forward-curving prows and bird-headed ornaments. But even on those carved walls, heavily stylized and filtered through Egyptian artistic conventions, you can pick out more than one hull design. Some appear to have different rigs, different stern shapes, different ways of managing oars and sails. That diversity may reflect the reality, not a single standardized fleet, but many boat traditions pressed into a common cause. Later, in the early Iron Age horizons that follow, you see similarly mixed signatures in new coastal settlements. Pottery styles from different regions appear together. House plans look like hybrids of inland and island traditions. Metalworking methods that used to be confined to one culture turn up abruptly in another. It's as if groups with separate backgrounds ended up living side by side, intermarrying trading techniques, and sometimes, presumably, fighting together. If you were a late Bronze Age palace scribe, how do you describe that? You don't have an ethnographic vocabulary for coalition of displaced economic actors operating in a fluid maritime environment. You have a category for foreign enemies who burn our stuff, so you flatten them. Egyptian texts speak of peoples of the sea as if they're a collective menace. They sometimes list group names, Shurden, Shekelesh, Peliset and others, but they're nearly always lumped together as a block. Hittite and Ugaritic letters use broad terms for raiders and enemies too, rarely pausing to parse which specific coastal community or alliance is which. This is a common habit of empires: reduce a tangle of distinct peoples into a single label that fits on a tablet and in a royal victory speech. Doing so has political advantages. If you're Rameses III, saying we defeated the sea peoples is far more satisfying than saying we fought various overlapping coalitions of displaced migrants, pirates and mercenaries whose exact composition we don't fully understand. The generic label turns a messy, adaptive phenomenon into a single monster you can claim to have slain. But the simplification comes at a cost for us. 3,000 years later, we inherit their categories. We rid sea peoples and unconsciously picture a single, coherent mystery nation, as if somewhere in the Bronze Age there was a homeland called Sea People Land, where everyone wore the same horned helmets and swore the same oaths. The evidence, thin as it is, points the other way. Those horned helmets may have been adopted by different groups copying a prestigious warrior style. The feathered headdresses carved in Egyptian stone could mark a particular contingent within a larger coalition, not an entire people. The variety of weapons, ships and settlement patterns argues strongly for diversity within the mystery army, not uniformity. Once you imagine it as many desperate groups moving in loose concert, new questions open up. How many of the invaders were actually aiming to settle, to find a patch of land and stop moving? How many would have preferred peaceful entry, offering military service in exchange for rations and fields, only to be rejected and forced into plunder? How many were following rumour chains? There is still grain in that delta, that island has not yet burned, the king in that city will hire foreign spearmen. In other words, we should picture not just battles but conversations, bargains struck on beaches, local elites deciding whether to admit a group as allies, vassals or mercenaries, or to try to drive them off. Families weighing impossible choices. Do we stay behind our city walls and hope the storehouses hold, or do we gamble everything on joining that flotilla anchored just offshore? Imagine a narrow coastal road at dusk. A line of carts creaks along, piled with whatever could be salvaged from a burned farm. Loom weights in sacks, bronze tools, a few jars of precious grain. The oxen are thin. Alongside the carts walk men with spears, some in old palace armour, some barefoot with scavenged shields. They're not marching in steady formation, they're trudging. At the head of the column, a scout points ahead to where the road bends down toward a harbour. Masts are there, black against the last light, their next transport, their next chance. Out at sea, another ship limps north, its sail patched, its crew thinning. 2 children share a cloak near the mast while their mother ladles out salted fish and soaked grain from a pot, barely big enough for one solid meal. The captain knows they can't keep doing this. They need resupply. They need a new home port. On the horizon, smoke from a distant city curls into the sky. These are the human threads running through the macro collapse. They're easy to lose when we talk about systems failure and multi-causal stresses. But those bigger patterns are made of decisions and non-decisions by people who woke up each day in a world that felt less safe than the day before. For them, piracy might not have looked like villainy. It looked like the last remaining option. Seen from that angle, the mystery army that destroyed every civilization could have been less like an organized conquering force and more like a weather front. A shifting front of people, some violent, some simply clinging on, pushed and pulled by climate, politics, famine and rumour. At different points along that front, you get different mixtures of refugees and raiders. Some fractions are hired and absorbed, others are fought and annihilated. Still others break through and plant the seeds of new communities on shattered coasts. That's why the mystery remains so stubborn. We want a single origin story, a neat explanation. The Sea Peoples were X. But every time we dig or model or reread the texts, what we see looks less like a single people and more like a process, a migration and warfare storm sweeping through a fragile world. The palaces that left us records didn't, or couldn't, describe that process in detail. They just saw ships on the horizon, fires in their coastal towns, unfamiliar weapons in their streets, and they wrote one fearful phrase in their own languages, the peoples of the sea. By the time those records were carved, the tide of movement was already reshaping the map. Some of those drifting communities would vanish into the ash layers, leaving nothing but broken blades and scattered bones. Others would endure under new names, in new configurations, on new shores. And when the smoke finally thinned and the last of the great Bronze Age palaces lay in ruins, the world they had dominated would be occupied by very different players. Some of them, very likely, the descendants of those same desperate sailors and cart-bound families whom scribes had once dismissed with a single label. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If the Sea Peoples were not a single unified nation, but many overlapping streams of people in motion, then what really stopped the old powers from recovering? If destruction came in pulses, and these warbands were as fragile as the states they attacked, why didn't the surviving kingdoms simply bounce back once the raids passed? To answer that, we have to look not just at who attacked the late Bronze Age world, but at what was left of its basic machinery once the storms, climatic, seismic and human, had rolled through. When we talk about great powers, it's easy to imagine something solid. Egypt, Hatti, Mycenaean, Ugarit, names that sound heavy, permanent, like carved stone. But structurally, these late Bronze Age kingdoms were not solid. They were more like intricate spiderwebs, beautiful, far-reaching, and astonishingly strong in some ways, provided nothing too big crashed into them. The problem is that by 1200 BC, too many things crashed into them at once. Start with how these states actually worked. A palace at the centre, bureaucrats and scribes inside it, storehouses attached to its walls, fields and villages and vassal towns in the orbit around it, and radiating out beyond that, trade routes, long ones, copper coming from Cyprus, tin trickling in via Anatolia or the eastern deserts, or still debated routes that may have stretched all the way to Central Asia. Timber floated down from distant mountains, grain shipped along coasts from surplus regions to deficit ones. The palace sat at the intersection of all of this and claimed credit for making it possible. Kings justified their rule not just with divine ancestry but with performance. I feed you, I protect you, I bring in the luxuries that prove the gods favour us. That's the narrow ridge their political legitimacy walked on. As long as the caravans arrived, as long as the warehouses filled, as long as the gods seemed to smile, the system made sense. But think about how many external pieces had to line up for that to keep working. You need stable, predictable harvests over a wide area so that some region always has surplus to share. You need secure sea lanes, or at least navies and garrisons strong enough to keep most pirates at bay. You need intermediary polities along the trade routes to stay functional, because if warfare or famine breaks out halfway along the road, your tin doesn't make it through. You need your own bureaucracy intact to count, store and redistribute everything without too much leakage. That's what historians mean when they talk about systemic fragility. It's not that each palace was weak by itself, it's that each palace depended on a long, multi-step chain of things it did not fully control. Once climate stresses increase, once earthquakes damage key ports, once armed migrants and raiders start punching holes in the trade networks, these chains start to snap. And because everything is so tightly interlocked, political authority, food security, foreign policy, prestige goods, the failures cascade. Inside the palaces, that cascade looked like administrative breakdown. For centuries, scribes had been the nervous system of the Bronze Age. They tracked rations for work crews. They recorded deliveries of copper ingots, chariot parts, textiles. They wrote the letters to foreign kings and merchants that kept diplomacy and trade humming. Their tablets tell us how many sickles a harvest team received, how much oil was allotted to a temple singer, How many spearmen were stationed at an outlying fortress in a given month? Then, in the destruction layers, the tablets stop. At Ugarit, the last letters pile up unbaked on the floors of the archive, as if no one had time to fire them. In other palaces, archives burn in place, jars of ceilings and piles of tablets cracked by heat. After those burn layers, in the early Iron Age levels, you often find nothing of the same scale. Local scripts may appear centuries later, but the old-style, palace-centred scribal apparatus simply doesn't come back. When the scribes go, the storage system goes with them. Those huge magazines full of grain and oil and textiles vanish from the archaeological record in many regions. Instead of monumental, multi-room storehouses with controlled access and seal marks, you get smaller silos, household-level storage, community granaries. That's not just an architectural change, it's a political one. It means the centre no longer gathers and reassigns the basic stuff of survival at the same scale. And if the palace isn't reliably feeding workers and soldiers, its professional army starts to unravel. Late Bronze Age warfare depended on specialisation. Chariotry units trained for years. Smiths and leatherworkers kept the equipment in fighting shape. Garrison troops counted on regular rations. All of that required steady inflow. Grain for pay, bronze for weapons, horses imported or bred on well-managed estates. Take away the palace's ability to concentrate surplus, and those professional soldiers face an immediate problem. They can't eat loyalty. As we saw, some drift into mercenary work. Some join coastal warbands or refugee coalitions. Some may retreat into the highlands as local strongmen. What they don't do, in most regions, is patiently sit around waiting for a monarch whose storehouses are empty to call them back into a permanent standing force. So you end up with a double disintegration. The writing stops, and with it the kind of fine-grained administrative control we see in earlier centuries. The big storage complexes vanish or shrink. The trained royal armies fragment. The old central machine doesn't just take a hit and then spin back up. It loses its basic moving parts. At this point, you might say, fine, so the old bronze-powered system collapses. Isn't this where iron rides in to save the day? Cheaper weapons for everyone, new tools, new armies. Shouldn't that make recovery easier? Iron does show up right around this time, but it doesn't work like flipping a switch from Bronze Age to Iron Age. It works more like a slow leak that, over generations, changes everything. Bronze depends on copper plus tin. Both of those are relatively scarce, and the easy sources are far from most population centres. That's why the late Bronze Age trade routes were so long and so critical. Iron, by contrast, is everywhere in the Earth's crust. But there's a catch. Early on, turning iron ore into usable metal is more technically finicky than making bronze. The smelting temperatures are higher. The product is often brittle bloom iron that needs extensive hammering and reheating to become strong. Early iron is often worse than good bronze for many purposes. So in the 13th and 12th centuries BC, what you see is not an instant revolution, but a tentative, uneven adoption. A few prestige iron objects early on. Some specialised centres starting to experiment with smelting and working iron blooms. Then, slowly, a widening circle of use, especially in areas where bronze supplies have become unreliable. For a while, bronze and iron coexist. High-status weapons and tools may still be bronze, especially where traditional supply lines survive. Iron shows up first in more ordinary or utilitarian contexts, or in regions already cut off from the main bronze pipelines. Only over long stretches of time, as techniques improve and the knowledge of ironworking spreads, does iron become a true mass material. That's important for our story because it means iron couldn't magically reconstitute the old palace states. The kings whose archives are burning don't have instant access to cheap iron arsenals. They're losing control right as the new technology is still patchy, expensive in expertise, even if cheap in ore. The real beneficiaries of iron, early on, may not be the old empires at all, but the small, scrappy polities that emerge in their ruins. Iron's long-term effect is democratization of metal. You no longer need to command far-flung trade and a network of tribute to arm warriors. If you can secure local ore, fuel, and skilled smiths, you can equip a modest, locally based force. That encourages a more fragmented political landscape, many little centres of power instead of a few giant ones. And that is exactly what the post-collapse world starts to look like. Because the breakdown was not uniform. If you zoom out across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, the early Iron Age is a patchwork map. Some regions do manage to rebuild relatively quickly. Egypt, for all its troubles, survives as a recognizable state. It loses territory, internal conflicts multiply, foreign trade shrinks, but the institution of pharaoh continues. In parts of inland Syria and northern Mesopotamia, new powers, like the Neo-Hittite city-states or Assyria, rise up within a few generations, drawing on older traditions but under new management. Elsewhere, the picture is harsher. Central Anatolia sees huge zones where population drops, urban centres vanish, and only scattered settlements remain for a time. In Greece, the old palatial centres go dark, and for a couple of centuries you see fewer and smaller sites, simpler burials, less imported luxury. Some scholars call this a dark age, not because nothing happens, but because large-scale, high-visibility structures and texts disappear. Coastal Levantine cities show mixed trajectories. Some are wiped out and only reoccupied centuries later. Others are rebuilt on a smaller footprint or under a new cultural identity. In a few cases, like the southern Levant, we start to see the emergence of new groups. The Philistines are one famous example, who blend local and foreign elements into something distinct from the late Bronze Age order. The outcome, then, is divergence. The same initial shock, climate stress, earthquakes, armed migration, trade disruption, hits the broader system, but the way communities respond varies based on geography, local resources, pre-existing social structures, sheer luck. Some areas turn inward and shrink to village-scale organisation. Others manage to stitch together regional powers again, often with different capital cities and ruling families than before. The imperial landscape doesn't reset to its old configuration. It rearranges into something new. Yet amid all the ruin, not everything breaks. Excavations at many sites show surprising threads of continuity. Certain craft traditions persist almost unchanged. Potters keep using familiar shapes and firing techniques, even when the stamps of palace ownership vanish. Textile tools, spindle whorls, loom weights, continue to appear in houses built on top of destroyed elite quarters. Local bronzesmiths adapt to scarcer supplies by recycling old metal, but their basic skill set carries through. Religious life also weaves across the break. Some cult sites are abandoned or destroyed. Others are rebuilt, sometimes repeatedly, on the same sacred spot. A hilltop sanctuary might lose its carved stone altar and imported figurines, then reappear a century later as a simpler shrine with clay offerings, but dedicated to a god with the same name. Temples in places like Byblos or certain Egyptian shrines show architectural layers that span this turbulent period, suggesting that the gods outlasted the kings who once claimed to serve them. And even though the great royal lineages fall silent in our sources, local elites often survive in altered form. In some regions, the title king gives way temporarily to ruler or mayor in inscriptions. Wealth is now measured in cattle or iron implements instead of golden cups from Mycenae, but there are still people with more land, more clients, more say than others. Those smaller elites become the seed stock for the next generation of states. All of this hints at a crucial shift in scale rather than a clean wipeout. The big, flashy, resource-hungry palatial system collapses, but immediately beneath it was another layer: village headmen, local cults, craft lineages, informal networks, that proves much more resilient. When the top fractures, that layer doesn't disappear. It adapts. From the distance of 3,000 years, what looks like the end of civilization may, on the ground, have felt more like a brutal compression. Life narrows. Travel becomes rarer and more dangerous. Choice of goods shrinks. Writing, if it exists at all, is confined to a few temples or border kingdoms. For many people, the world contracts to a few days' walk in any direction. But human strategies for cooperation, for belief, for making and trading things, don't vanish. They mutate. This is why the great powers couldn't simply bounce back. The palatial system wasn't a rubber ball that you could drop and expect to spring to its original shape. It was an elaborate high-maintenance machine built on long-distance inputs, specialist knowledge, and a very particular political formula. We are the ones who can keep all this complexity running. Once repeated shocks exposed that boast as hollow. Once caravans stopped arriving, once the army pay ran out, once the townsfolk saw that the palace could not, in fact, protect them from famine or raiders, the legitimacy scaffolding crumbled along with the stone walls. Rebuilding that exact arrangement would have required not only physical reconstruction, but widespread belief that the system was worth restoring. In many places, that belief never came back. Instead, people experimented with other forms, smaller kingdoms, tribal confederations, city-states, new ethnic identities. Iron, slowly but inexorably, made it easier for those smaller units to arm themselves without plugging back into vast bronze supply chains. Older cults grounded them in familiar sacred geographies. Old crafts gave them practical continuity. So when we talk about the late Bronze Age collapse, it might be more accurate to think of it as a major phase change. The water in the pot did not disappear. It boiled, steamed, condensed in new places. The old imperial web tore, and in the tatters new knots formed. Out of those knots, in the following centuries, would come the world of the biblical kingdoms, the Phoenician traders, the early Greek city-states, the rising Assyrian Empire, a world that feels much closer to the classical and even modern landscapes we recognise. But what happened to the people who helped rip the old web apart? The so-called Sea Peoples, the Mystery Army. Did they simply vanish once the palaces burned? Or did they too melt into these new configurations under new names? To trace their fate, we have to follow the silence, the gaps in the record where an enemy disappears from royal inscriptions and new communities suddenly appear on the archaeological map. If you flip through the written sources, it really does look like they drop off a cliff. For a brief window, around the reigns of Meneptah and Rameses III, the inscriptions are obsessed with them. The Great Harris Papyrus, the reliefs at Medinet Habu, scattered references in Egyptian texts and maybe hints in Hittite and Levantine letters. This coalition of raiders, migrants, warriors, whatever they were, looms large. Then, nothing. Later, Egyptian kings don't mention them. Assyrian annals, once they ramp up a few centuries later, are full of campaigns and enemies, but not sea peoples as such. The specific ethnonyms we see paraded at Medinet Habu, Shurden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Dnyan, Cheka, either fade out or reappear in very different guises. It's tempting to imagine a single decisive battle, where Rameses III annihilates them and writes the ending himself. The reliefs certainly encourage that reading. Chariots overturned, ships tangled, bodies piled. But inscriptions are propaganda, not documentaries. Rameses needed to be the king who made firm the borders and trampled the foreign lands. Admitting that some of these groups slipped past him, settled, traded, or even served in his army is not the story you carve on your mortuary temple. So one reason the trail goes cold is simple narrative control. Once these people stop being a perfect foil, a terrifying invader you can claim to have defeated, they no longer belong on royal monuments. That doesn't mean they stopped existing. It means they stopped being politically useful as the enemy. There's another quieter reason the record goes silent. Literacy itself shrinks. The world that named and listed the Sea Peoples was a scribble world. Palaces, archives, diplomatic letters. When those palaces burn or contract, the habit of carefully recording the names of every foreign contingent sailing along the coast goes with them. The people we call Sea Peoples don't vanish. The bureaucrats who would have written their names do. That's where archaeology has to take over. And archaeology tells a very different kind of story, one of dispersal, blending, and slow-motion transformation rather than sudden extinction. Start with the southern Levant, the coastal strip that later texts will call Philistia. In the 12th century BC, right after the period of Rameses III's battles, we see something new appear in the excavation layers at sites like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, maybe Gaza. The pottery changes. Instead of purely local Canaanite styles, we find wares with shapes and painted designs that look a lot like what you'd see in the Aegean, spirals, birds, geometric bands, then gradually morph into their own regional style, often called Philistine pottery. Alongside the pots, you get new cooking habits. People start using different types of hearths and jugs. They butcher animals in slightly different ways. Pig bones show up more often in some sites, which stands out against neighbouring highland communities where pig remains are rare. None of this screams, here is a people straight off the ships from Medinet Habu. Archaeology almost never gives us neat ethnic labels, but the timing, the location, and the blend of local and foreign elements make many scholars think, this is one of the settlement zones for groups that had earlier appeared in Egyptian texts as part of that mysterious coalition. The Peliset of Rameses inscriptions are widely, though not universally, linked to the later Philistines. If that's even roughly right, then one answer to where did they go is they stopped being an army and started being neighbours. The coalition breaks apart, households form, warbands turn into towns. Within a few generations, their grandchildren are not mercenaries on somebody else's payroll, but farmers and artisans arguing with the guy next door over a boundary stone. The coastal plains further north show similar, if less dramatic, hints. At sites in the northern Levant, you sometimes see layers of destruction, followed by reoccupation under a slightly different material culture, new fortification styles, different house plans, imported pottery from places that hadn't traded much before. In a few instances, inscriptions from the early Iron Age mention rulers with names that don't easily fit older local patterns. Are these the descendants of Jekka or Danaan groups who carved out little city-states? Possibly. The evidence is thin, but it's consistent with a pattern. Parts of the Mystery Army don't stay mobile forever. They take ports, they keep them, and over time they blend in. Islands were another likely refuge and base. Cyprus clearly goes through conflict and upheaval, but by the early Iron Age several Cypriot cities recover with a twist. Their material culture shows a mix of older Eastern Mediterranean elements and new features that look Aegean-influenced. Some scholars argue that groups who had once been involved in raiding or escorting fleeing populations end up settling there. Fragments of that broad maritime world turning into local elites on an island that still commands key sea routes. The Aegean Islands and coastal Anatolia probably tell similar stories, though the record is patchy. Places like the Dodecanese, Crete, or the South Anatolian coast sit astride the very lanes these war fleets must have used. If a shipload or two of displaced warriors and families found a bay with decent farmland and a defensible hill, that might be all they needed to start again. Within a century their descendants would be speaking the local language with a regional accent, marrying into neighbouring families, and leaving us nothing but subtle shifts in house shapes and grave goods to hint at their origins. Not everyone stayed on the coasts. Some groups likely followed refugees inland, up river valleys, and into highland zones that had been on the fringe of the Bronze Age system. When cities fall and ports burn, hills and interior plateaus become attractive. They're harder to raid, easier to defend, and often less tightly tied to imperial bureaucracy. In these inland refuges we see the rise of what later texts call peoples or tribes with new names, early Aramaean groups in parts of Syria, clusters of small polities in central Anatolia, tribal confederations in the steppe margins. A portion of the people who once rode and fought in the Mystery Army could easily have dissolved into these evolving communities. A man who yesterday was a Sheridan raider on an Egyptian inscription might, 15 years later, be an anonymous head of a household in an upland village, his children growing up bilingual, his old bronze helmet hanging on the wall as an heirloom with a half-remembered story. Some may even have gone home, insofar as that word still meant anything. If parts of the coalition were originally recruited from Aegean palatial states, Mycenaean realms already tottering under their own pressures, there's nothing stopping survivors of East Mediterranean campaigns from sailing or hiking back west, only to find their original centres changed or collapsed. They might arrive not as conquering heroes, but as latecomers to a disaster. Palaces looted, fields abandoned, local chiefs already carving up the ruins. They could have slotted themselves into those new hierarchies, bringing with them combat experience, foreign contacts, and stories of faraway wars that never made it into written form. Others, of course, didn't make it anywhere. Campaigning as mobile coalitions in a time of famine, plague, and political breakdown is dangerous work. Some contingents might have been smashed outright in failed landings or punished expeditions. Small groups that tried to seize well-defended towns without local support could simply have been killed, enslaved, or scattered beyond recognition. The dead leave fewer traces than the settlers. Taken together, the most plausible picture is not a single fate, but a branching tree of outcomes. The coalition that Egyptians and maybe Hittites faced was never a unified nation to begin with. It was a temporary alignment of interests, mercenaries out of a job, displaced farmers looking for new land, opportunistic pirates, ambitious chiefs testing the boundaries of fading empires. Once the big campaigns end, that loose alliance doesn't need to stay together. Some fragments embed themselves in new coastal polities. Some become the nucleus of inland tribes. Some are swallowed up by older populations. Some are erased by defeat or simple demographic drift. Within 2 or 3 generations, the people who actually rowed the boats and drew the swords are gone as a self-aware, named group. even if their descendants remain everywhere, in gene pools, in craft traditions, in small shifts to cuisine and burial practice. That's how later identities form in this part of the world. You don't get clean breaks where one people dies and another appears out of thin air. You get constant remixing. New polities emerge, Philistine city-states along the southern coast, early highland kingdoms to their east, Phoenician ports to the north, Neo-Hittite states in inland Syria and Anatolia. Each of them cobbles together its identity from whatever is at hand. Local Canaanite or Anatolian traditions, incoming languages and lineages, memories of older empires, and, quite possibly, the descendants of those very warbands that roamed the sea a generation or two earlier. Languages shift, split, and merge. The tongue spoken in a 12th century Canaanite port might, by the 10th century, be called Phoenician by outsiders, even though much of its vocabulary and grammar continues an older line. The speech of coastal newcomers from the Aegean blends with that of the locals, then, under the pressure of trade and intermarriage, settles into a new dialect that later scribes might label in hindsight as Philistine, or simply ignore altogether. The original words the warbands used for themselves, names shouted across ship decks in some half-lost idiom, disappear, replaced by labels applied by neighbours, rivals, and eventually imperial administrators. Myths and stories get recycled too. Hero tales from collapsing Mycenaean palaces may have travelled east with displaced warriors, then seeped into Levantine storytelling. Generations later, versions of those tales could drift back west, woven into the oral traditions that will eventually solidify as Homeric epics. Likewise, Bronze Age memories of invasions and seaborne raiders might echo faintly in much later biblical narratives about peoples from the sea or confederations of foreign foes, even if the historical specifics have been thoroughly scrambled. By the time written sources pick up again in a big way, Assyrian annals carving lists of conquered kings, Hebrew scribes composing and editing historical narratives, Greek poets performing in newly forming city-states, the individuals who once terrified Ramesses' scribes are long dead. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren appear in those texts under completely different banners. Philistines, Aramaeans, Phoenicians, assorted peoples of the coast, and kings of the isles. In that sense, the Mystery Army doesn't so much vanish as lose its costume. The coalition dissolves into the background fabric of early Iron Age society. What had briefly been visible as a single, named menace, becomes archaeologically and textually ordinary. Village pottery, pig bones, repurposed bronze, the occasional foreign-style helmet in a grave. When we look back from our vantage point, we're tempted to ask for a singular villain, a roaming horde that toppled civilization and then marched off into legend. The late Bronze Age collapse stubbornly refuses to give us that. The Sea Peoples, whatever exact mix of groups they contained, were part of a much larger storm. Climate shocks, earthquakes, trade breakdowns, internal revolts, ambitious generals, frightened migrants, hungry children. Some of the faces in that storm fought on ships off the Nile Delta, some torched storehouses at Ugarit, some guarded caravans or opened their gates to refugees, or sat on palace benches trying to decide which side to back. A few of their names made it into frozen lines of hieroglyphs and cuneiform. Most did not. So when we ask, where did the Mystery Army go, the answer is everywhere and nowhere. They stopped appearing on monuments and started appearing in cemeteries, in hilltop villages, in the genetic and cultural mix of the peoples who came after. Not as a single, enduring Sea People nation, but as threads woven into the new tapestry that replaced the Bronze Age world. The collapse, in other words, wasn't the work of one mythic invader that disappeared without a trace. It was a convergence of forces, drought and tremors, kings and captains, farmers and raiders, all pulling at the same overstretched web until it tore. And when the dust settled and the scribes found new patrons, the labels changed, but the human beings, in all their messy continuity, remained. When the web finally tears and the dust begins to settle, what's left is not an empty map. It's a different kind of world. If you could stand somewhere high above the eastern Mediterranean around, say, 1000 BC and look down, you wouldn't see the great glowing nodes that had dominated 300 years earlier. No more Hattusa, no more Mycenaean palaces humming with scribes, no more Ugarit writing to half the known world from its archives by the sea. Egypt is still there, but it's smaller, more defensive, more inward-looking. Instead of a handful of superpowers running long-distance trade like a set of coordinated conveyor belts, you'd see dozens, maybe hundreds of smaller lights. Hilltop towns, modest port cities, fortified villages perched above river valleys. This is the Iron Age landscape being born. Trade doesn't disappear, it shrinks and reroutes. Where once a handful of massive palaces sent out fleets and caravans to move copper from Cyprus, tin from who knows where, cedar from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia and grain from Egypt, now smaller players take up the slack. Phoenician cities along the Levantine coast, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, start to stitch together a new maritime network, one that hops from port to port instead of radiating from a single imperial centre. The Philistine cities do their own version of this on a more local scale, acting as brokers between inland highlands and the sea. Over in Anatolia, instead of one big Hittite state, you get Neo-Hittite and Luwian principalities, Carchemish, Melid, Kumu, and a dozen others, each with its own little court, its own local god, its own slice of the old road system. Some mint their own seals, some carve inscriptions in hieroglyphic Luwian, some simply exist in the background of later Assyrian campaigns, popping into view just long enough to pay tribute or get conquered. Greece looks different too. The big Mycenaean palaces are gone. Linear B, the palace script, disappears. For a while, the archaeological record in parts of the mainland is thin. Fewer big buildings, simpler burials, more modest villages. But in this apparently quieter world, iron trickles in, then becomes common. Pottery styles shift and proliferate. Local chiefs rise, fall, and feud. Identity stops being something enforced by a bureaucratic centre and becomes something negotiated in small councils, warbands, and shrine gatherings. Warfare changes along with everything else. In the late Bronze Age, chariots are the prestige weapon. They require roads, workshops, trained teams of horses, elite drivers and archers. They're the military expression of a bureaucratic world, costly, specialised, and tied to palace economies that can afford them. When those economies crack, so do the chariot corps. In the early Iron Age, you see a different pattern, more infantry, more flexible equipment, spears, swords, round shields that can be made and maintained by local smiths rather than palace arsenals. Armour shifts from rare bronze pieces to simpler gear, sometimes just thick linen or leather. Iron weapons start to appear, at first as luxury items, then more widely. Not because iron is better in some magical way. It's often inferior to high-quality bronze at first, but because the ore is more widely available. You don't need access to distant tin mines, you just need local deposits and the skill to work them. This democratizes violence. You no longer need to be plugged into a continental supply chain to arm a fighting force. A local chief with a decent ironworker can equip his men well enough to matter. Battles become less about two chariot elites meeting on a carefully chosen field, and more about raids, sieges of modest strongholds, skirmishes in rough country, ambushes on trade routes. War becomes messier, more local, and in some ways more constant. The gods don't go away either. They get reinterpreted. Storm gods who once sat atop imperial pantheons, Teshub in Hatti, Baal in Ugarit, reappear under slightly different names in Neo-Hittite inscriptions and Levantine cults. Local deities fuse, split and migrate. A war god in one city becomes a patron of kingship in another. Shrines that survived the fires become focal points for new communities. Others are abandoned, their sacred stones left standing in silent fields, their stories moving on into other sanctuaries. But if you want to see what the collapse really left behind, you have to listen, not just look. Because while archives burned, memory didn't. Later cultures never forgot that there had been a time when great powers fell and cities were wiped away. They just told the story in their own languages, for their own purposes. Greek epic stands right at this crossroads. By the time the Iliad and the Odyssey are taking shape in oral tradition, centuries have passed since the Mycenaean palaces fell. The poets who sing of Troy are not palace scribes preserving a court chronicle. They're performers in an Iron Age world, shaping inherited story fragments into something that makes sense to their audiences. Still, look at the themes. Far-travelling fleets, sieges of fortified cities, coalitions of kings, heroes wandering among strange foreign coasts, ruins that people visit and point at as the place where X happened. It's not a documentary of the late Bronze Age collapse, but it feels like cultural aftershock. Memories of once great places that are now mounds, half-remembered names of peoples and cities, sometimes distorted, sometimes eerily persistent, a sense that there was an older, grander world, and that something broke it. The Hebrew Bible does its own version of this. Written and edited much later, it nonetheless preserves stories of Philistines on the coastal plains, of fortified Canaanite cities, of plagues and famines, of shifting tribal identities in the highlands. The Philistines appear as a major antagonist in some narratives, fully settled and politically organized, exactly what we think those former Sea Peoples groups became a couple of centuries after their dramatic arrival. You also get echoes of an age of upheaval, migrations, invasions, sudden destructions, long journeys through wilderness. These texts aren't neutral records, they're theological and political works, but embedded in them are memories of a landscape still shaped by the aftermath of the collapse. Ruined tells on the horizon, foreign-style burials occasionally unearthed, local shrines of terrifying age, boundary disputes over land that has changed hands too many times. Further east, Assyrian annals start to pick up the new map. They don't mention the Sea Peoples as such, but they do mention the patchwork of small states and city kings that replaced the Bronze Age order. To the Assyrians, these are just targets and tributaries, kings of the seacoast, kings of the Hatti land, kings of the Isles of the Sea. In those dry lists of conquered cities and levied tribute, you can glimpse the new normal. Not a single Hittite great king, but 10 little rulers in his old territory. Not Ugarit, but a chain of lesser ports. Not one tidy system, but a mosaic. So when we talk about what the collapse left behind, we're looking at several layers at once. A physical layer, ruined palaces, burned archives, abandoned harbours, repurposed fortresses. A social layer, smaller polities, more localized elites, new coalitions and confederations. A technological layer, iron gradually displacing bronze, infantry eclipsing chariots, shipbuilding evolving for new kinds of trade and raiding. And a narrative layer, tales of fallen cities, wandering heroes, lost golden ages echoing down the centuries. Underneath all of that lie a few big lessons that historians and archaeologists keep circling back to. First, interconnectedness is powerful and fragile. The late Bronze Age international system was astonishingly sophisticated for its time. Royal daughters moved across continents as diplomatic brides. Letters travelled between kings who called each other brother. A shortage of grain in one region could be patched by shipments from another. Copper from Cyprus and tin from Central Asia or Europe met in Levantine workshops to become weapons that might end up in Egypt or Greece. That same interconnectedness meant that shocks cascaded. A drought reduces harvests in one area. That means more grain ships needed from a neighbour who's already stretched thin. A bad earthquake takes out a key port. Trade routes reroute through more dangerous waters, where piracy suddenly becomes more tempting and more lucrative. A big empire fails to pay its mercenaries on time. Those mercenaries start looking for their own opportunities. A city-state that depends on imported copper for its workshop economy suddenly can't get enough. Unemployed artisans become raiders or migrants. None of these things by themselves have to destroy civilization, but when they happen together in a tightly coupled system, failures pile up. Feedback loops kick in. Attempts to fix one problem, say, launching a campaign to seize grain or copper, can aggravate others by further destabilizing trade and security. The Sea Peoples, whatever their exact composition, were both a symptom and a cause of this feedback. People pushed into motion by crisis, who in turn made the crisis worse wherever they went. Second, crises compound across domains. This wasn't just a military problem, it was environmental stress, economic contraction, political overextension, social unrest and violence all happening at once, in ways that amplified one another. The letters from Ugarit we still have. Panic about enemy ships, pleas for grain, reports of drought, read like dispatches from a system trying to solve too many problems with too few tools. Third, our evidence has limits, and those limits shape our stories. We have a handful of inscriptions from Egypt, scattered references from Hatti and the Levant, some burnt clay tablets from Ugarit, later echoes in Greek and biblical texts, layers of destruction and reconstruction in cities from Greece to Israel, cargoes trapped in shipwrecks, and patterns in pots, bones and house foundations. That's not nothing. But compared to what actually happened, the full range of human decisions, fears, alliances, betrayals, ingenious fixes that almost worked, We're looking at shadows. We don't have the archives of Hattusa for those crucial last decades. Much of what survived was written earlier. We don't have the full diplomatic files from Ugarit. Just whatever happened to be fired when the palace went up in flames. We don't have daily records from the villages and camps where migrants regrouped. We don't have the songs they sang about why they left, or the oaths they swore before launching their ships. Sometime in the future, we might find more. There are probably still Bronze Age archives buried under later cities, waiting for a construction project to slice through them. There are almost certainly more shipwrecks like Uluburun and Cape Gelidonia resting on the seafloor, their cargoes locked in deep water and anoxic mud. There are inscriptions eroding out of remote rock faces in Anatolia and Syria that no one has photographed yet, or that sit in museum basements still undeciphered. Even with new discoveries, though, the record will remain patchy. That's how the past is. It doesn't come to us as a finished narrative, it comes as fragments. Part of the intellectual challenge is to hold those fragments without pretending they fill the whole puzzle. That means getting comfortable with uncertainty. We can say with reasonable confidence that the late Bronze Age collapse was a multi-causal, region-wide transformation in which climate stress, internal revolts, economic fragility, and external attacks, including those by groups we shorthand as sea peoples, all played a part. We can say that the aftermath produced a new landscape of smaller polities, altered trade routes, and changed warfare. We can trace lines from that new world forward: Phoenician expansion, the rise of Israel and Judah, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Greek city-states. What we can't do is point to a single battle, a single conspiracy, or a single marching horde and say that's the whole story. We can't tell you exactly who was on each ship, or what language they shouted in as they closed in on an Egyptian beach. We can't reconstruct every step a displaced family took from a burned village to a new home 200 miles away. Instead, we work with probabilities and patterns. We say likely, possibly, on current evidence. We build models and then watch them get reshaped as new data comes in. And, if we're being honest, we learn to inhabit the space between knowing and not knowing, to let the mystery sharpen our questions instead of shutting them down, because there are still deep, tantalizing gaps. Somewhere on the seabed there are wrecks of ships that carried those raiders and migrants. Their hulls might still hold weapons, personal belongings, cargo that would tell us who hired them, where they had been, and where they hoped to go. Somewhere under layers of later building, there may be a palace archive from a city like Ugarit, or a port on Cyprus that preserves the words of a king trying to negotiate with these newcomers instead of fighting them. Somewhere in an undeciphered inscription or a miscatalogued tablet might be a different name for the sea peoples, a name they used for themselves. Until we find those things, if we ever do, the late Bronze Age collapse will remain partly opaque. Not a solved mystery, but a live one. And that, finally, is why the story still matters. We live in a world that is, in some ways, even more interconnected than the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Our trade routes are global, our supply chains are tight, our climate is shifting, our political systems are under stress in ways that sometimes feel eerily familiar. Powerful states stretched thin, complex networks vulnerable to shock, displaced populations on the move by land and sea. The fall of those earlier systems doesn't give us a script for our future. History doesn't repeat in that neat a way. But it does offer a kind of mirror. It shows what can happen when complexity outruns resilience, when safety nets depend on a few key nodes, when multiple crises hit at once, and when responses are improvised under pressure. It also shows what comes after isn't necessarily the end. People adapt. New forms of organization appear. Technologies shift to match new realities. Stories evolve to make sense of the trauma. The world after the collapse was not a blank. It was a rearrangement. Out of that rearrangement came the Iron Age cultures that would, in turn, shape the classical civilizations many of us know better. So as we follow the trail of the Sea Peoples and the shattered Bronze Age world they helped pull apart, we're not just gawking at an ancient disaster. We're watching a stress test of an interconnected system not unlike our own. We're seeing how fragile power can be, how quickly the unthinkable can become ordinary, and how much of that process we can glimpse, and how much will always be lost just beyond the edge of the surviving record. The Mystery Army, the burning palaces, the silent archives. They're not just distant curiosities. They're part of a story that still breathes, because we're still living with the same questions. How stable is our web? How do we cope when it starts to fray? And what traces of us will be left thousands of years from now for someone else to puzzle over? In the final act of this story, we'll step back even further, away from the names and the shards and the broken walls, and look at the collapse not as a closed case, but as an ongoing conversation between the past and the present, a mystery that, by refusing to resolve neatly, keeps teaching us how to think about our own uncertain future. So when we talk about an army that came out of nowhere, broke the back of a whole international system, and then seemed to vanish, we're really standing at the intersection of all those threads. On one side, the documents that survived give us that one chilling label, Sea Peoples. Enemy ships on the horizon, strange names in Egyptian reliefs, hastily drawn battle scenes where foreign warriors pile up before the pharaoh's chariots. From that angle, it looks like a simple story. A wave of invaders appears, devastates everything, and disappears again into the dark. On the other side, the archaeology refuses to cooperate with any simple script. It shows palaces burning not all on the same day, but over decades, some cities abandoned, others rebuilt, local rebellions, slow declines, and sudden shocks layered on top of one another. It shows climate stress building in tree rings and lake cores, harvests getting tighter, trade networks fraying. It shows people on the move long before anyone carved sea peoples into stone. Those two views don't cancel each other out. They sit side by side, and the real story lives in the tension between them. Most specialists today, looking at all the scraps we've recovered, end up with something like a weighted list rather than a single culprit. Climate variability and drought, very likely important, especially for regions already living close to the edge. Palace economies depending on long-distance trade for bronze, luxury goods and legitimacy. Highly vulnerable once those routes faltered. Internal unrest and local uprisings. Almost certainly part of the picture in more than one kingdom. Raiding coalitions of displaced peoples, some of whom the Egyptians called sea peoples, also there, hitting at just the worst possible time. If you imagine the late Bronze Age system as a web of cords stretched tight, each of those factors is a hand tugging from a different direction. No single pull necessarily snaps the whole thing. But when several hands pull at once, while the cords are already thinning with age and weather, there comes a moment when something gives, and once one strand breaks, say the fall of a key port or the collapse of a major buyer of copper, the tension redistributes, strains multiply elsewhere, more cords fray. In that sense, the Mystery Army is not so much a single, neatly organized force as a moment when many different processes show up in the same frame. Refugees turned raiders, mercenaries turned conquerors, coastal communities turned opportunists, farmers turned migrants. Egyptian scribes saw all of that from the deck of a royal barge or the walls of a delta fortress and needed a name. They reached for a label that would make sense to their king and their gods. We inherited that label and for a long time let it stand in for the entire disaster. But if we step back and let the different kinds of evidence talk to each other, a more nuanced picture starts to emerge. The best supported scenario looks like this. A period of environmental stress puts pressure on harvests across the eastern Mediterranean. That stress hits hardest in places where the economy is already delicate, where elites are deeply invested in imported metals, foreign timber, prestige goods that keep their clients loyal. As grain and copper become harder to get, palace centres struggle to meet obligations, rations to workers, pay to soldiers, gifts to vassals. Confidence erodes. Local chiefs eye independence. Borderlands become harder to police. At the same time, earthquakes and localised disasters knock out harbours and towns in unlucky places. Trade routes have to reroute. Voyages get longer and riskier. Piracy, always a temptation in tight straits and island chains, begins to blur into something larger as more groups are pushed into desperate calculations, raid or starve. Mercenary bands already used to selling their skills may find their employers suddenly unable to pay in full. They drift toward other patrons, or toward self-employment. Out of that stew of stress and opportunity, coalitions form. Some are land-based confederations, others are maritime, groups who control ships and coastal bases and can move quickly between weak points in the system. They raid, they migrate, they fight, they settle. In some places they meet exhausted garrisons and burn everything. In others they strike bargains and become new ruling elites. In still others they're turned back after hard campaigns. When those coalitions appear in Egyptian waters, They're close enough in time and style to get bundled together in Egyptian memory as a single menace. The pharaoh's victory inscriptions capture a snapshot of that moment, like a photograph taken halfway through a long storm. We see the wave just as it slams into one shore. We don't see all the winds that created it, or the other coasts already flooded. The synchronized feeling of the collapse, the eerie impression that every civilization went down at once, comes partly from our evidence. We stack destruction layers from dozens of sites on a single timeline. We line up written pleas from Ugarit with burnt layers in Cyprus, with abandoned fortresses in Anatolia, with depopulated Mycenaean centres. On the page, that can look like a single apocalyptic year. On the ground, it was likely a generation or more of overlapping crises, long enough for people to grow up in the middle of it, remembering a childhood of burning horizons as simply the way things are. The neat army that appears, destroys and vanishes is in the end a kind of compression. It's what happens when human beings, ancient or modern, try to turn a messy, many-cause transformation into a story we can hold in our heads. There's comfort in that. A single enemy, a single cause, a single battle to win or lose. But the late Bronze Age won't quite let us have that. Instead, it leaves us with a world that rearranges itself in slow motion. Imagine that world in transition. The great palaces of Mycenae and Knossos and Hattusa stand blackened on their hills, their storerooms looted, their halls open to the sky. In some of them, wild grasses push through cracked flagstones where kings once poured libations. In harbours along the Levant, collapsed warehouses slump into the water, their key stones tilting. The last bronze ingots traded under the old system lie forgotten in a storeroom nobody ever came back to inventory. But not everything is ruin. In the valleys and uplands behind those dead palaces, smoke rises from new clusters of houses, timber walls instead of carved stone, thatched roofs instead of gleaming tiles. Fields are being cleared by people who may once have laboured in palace workshops or marched in palace armies. They are now farming for themselves, under smaller chiefs whose names never made it into international correspondence. Along the coasts, new towns slowly claim the empty spaces. They build their own shrines, their own marketplaces, their own ways of measuring trust. Some of the faces in those towns are local. Others carry memories of long voyages and battles under foreign banners. The children growing up there learn hybrid languages, hybrid cooking, hybrid gods. Trade never truly stops. It bends. Smaller ships hug the coasts where once big cargo vessels crossed open leagues of sea. Copper finds new routes. Iron smelters smoke in places where no such furnaces existed a few generations before. The gods themselves shift thrones. A storm god once invoked in Hittite ritual now listens to prayers in a Neo-Hittite hilltop temple, under a slightly new name, to the sound of a different language. If you could stand on a high ridge somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean around 1050 BC and look out, not just with your eyes, but with a kind of time sense, you'd see the ghost of the old system superimposed on the new. Under your feet, buried roads and foundations leading to ruined courts. On the horizon, fresh stone walls of new city-states rising on older mounds. In the harbours, a mix of old hull designs and new, crews-speaking dialects that didn't exist a century earlier. The mystery army is gone in any organised sense. Nobody's calling themselves sea peoples as an ethnic badge. But their passage is written into the map, in which towns become Philistine, which become Phoenician, which never recover at all. It's written into the genes of later populations, the pottery shapes they favour, the stories they tell about ancestors who came from across the sea, or down from the mountains, or out of the ruins of forgotten kings. That's what it means to say this mystery still breathes. It isn't a cold case file we can close with a single culprit circled in red ink. It's a living question about how complex societies break and reform, about how people respond when the networks they rely on start to fail, about what kinds of violence and creativity emerge in the cracks. We keep returning to the late Bronze Age collapse, not because we expect it to hand us a prophecy, but because it forces us to think in layers. Environment and politics, trade and war, stories and stones. It asks us to hold multiple possibilities at once, and to be honest about what we know, what we suspect, and what will probably always lie beyond our reach. If you've made it this far, you're now part of that ongoing conversation. You've walked through the silent palaces and crowded harbours and battle-scarred coastlines in your mind. You've met the scribes in Ugarit, the kings in Egypt, the merchants in Cyprus, the migrants on the waves, so I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this journey into the Bronze Age, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. It genuinely helps more people find these long, strange stories from the past. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. One of the joys of making these is knowing that somewhere out there, someone in Athens or Cairo or Sydney or a small town nowhere near the Mediterranean is following the trail of the sea peoples along with you. Drop your city or country below, I read those, and it's a reminder that our own world is stitched together by invisible lines of connection too. If this kind of big, long-scale mystery is your thing, I've also written a book that steps even further back in time, into the deep prehistory of our species, bottlenecks, near extinctions, and the strange, fragile paths that led to us. It's all about prehistoric secrets that don't often make it into school textbooks, told in the same slow, story-driven way we've used here. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. However you came here, whether you're a long-time history nerd or you just wandered in wondering who the Sea Peoples were, thanks for spending this time in the ruins of the Bronze Age with me. The palaces are ash, the archives are silent, the mystery army has no one clear name, but the questions they leave behind are still very much alive.